back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin, broadcasting to you here once again from Moscow, Russia, nearing the end of my trip. I've been here perhaps longer than I anticipated, but it's been a wonderful time. Obviously, this week of World War III analysis is going to be massive. This episode is being recorded right off the supposed, at least, acceptance of the Trump-Gaza peace plan by both the Israeli side, Netanyahu, and Hamas. Obviously, we're in the midst of the working out of the details. We now know that Dahmer and Witkoff from the Israeli and U.S. sides, respectively, are going to be traveling to Egypt to begin the negotiations regarding the ceasefire. Hamas has tentatively accepted. They want some clarifications on disarmament, on the international coalition that is going to be ruling Gaza. So we're going to be discussing all of that, all the details of Trump's peace plan, everything else going on in the Palestinian region, of course, with huge strikes on Lebanon, with the new disarmament plan for Hezbollah. The Houthis have announced their statements. And of course, we're going to be getting into Iran, where it seems like more and more likely the 12-day war was just the appetizer, and we're going to be experiencing a rapid escalation between Israel and Iran, as Israel seems to be preparing more strikes on Iran, as snapback sanctions in the UN and the JCPOA were obviously activated against Iran, despite strong objections from China and Russia. Russia is fast shipping MiG-29s in the absence of Su-35s, as well as massive amounts of air defenses to Iran. We're going to be discussing Venezuela as well and Russia's assistance for them, all sorts of other regions of the world, everything going on, of course, in Asia with the Japanese elections, then the Moldovan elections. Obviously, we're going to be breaking those down. And then, of course, church persecution news always comes at the end. And we're going to talk about, the female Archbishop of Canterbury, all the other nonsense going on in the Anglican world. But before we dive into that, I want to, thank everyone for your prayers. I just returned from the Donbass. I spent 4 days down in Donetsk, Lugansk briefly as well, with some good friends of ours, Andrei Afanasiev, who those who listen to the show in Ether Hour are big fans of him. He has done some incredible episodes, so perhaps we will link one of those below. But if you want to keep up to date and keep in touch with all the things that I did down in Donbass, be sure to follow us here on Substack, worldwarnow.co. Follow us on social medias. Follow me at GnomeRad. Follow us on Twitter at WorldWarNow_. Obviously, follow the World War Now Telegram, because very soon on the Substack, on the YouTube, I'm going to be releasing some videos, some sort of short documentary clips, some interviews that I did, a lot of really great content that's going to be subtitled, well edited, is coming very, very soon. So get behind the paywall here on Substack, not just to hear that, but to support the show, to support all the work I've been doing, all the travel, all this intensive work. I'm exhausted, if I'm being honest, and I really hate seeing the big dip that we get in paid subscribers every time that I do these intensive trips. So please, please, please consider getting behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. Obviously, that's going to be linked in the description. If you are not listening to this podcast on Substack, be sure to also follow us wherever else podcasts are found, and like this episode. That's one of the most important things as well. Like the episode on Substack, share it with your friends, like it on YouTube if you're listening there. So I've gotten all that out of the way. Again, thank you all for your prayers. I have some stories I'll share later this episode about what happened. It was not all, safe. There were definitely some dangerous moments. So stay tuned for that, but we'll save that perhaps more for the end. So you have to give us all of the engagement that we want, right? But before we dive into the Palestine-Gaza peace plan, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. It's very good to hear that you're safe and sound. Great to hear from you again. And, this week it's been very eventful. We are approaching, of course, me and Conrad, of course, are recording on the 4th of October, but we are approaching that key date, the birthday of President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin on the 7th of October. But now this date is remembered for something else. In particular, the event that took place in the Middle East exactly 2 years ago. So at the time of your listening to this episode, most likely on the eve of October 7th, perhaps this peace treaty has already been signed, and Trump can officially proclaim himself as, potentially the future recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this is all very hypothetical and in the air. However, Trump's proposed, steps of, the steps that Hamas need to essentially accept alongside of Netanyahu, the Israeli leadership, in order for peace to come into existence, have already been proposed. Now, mind you, last week we talked about how Trump met with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, how he met with various other Middle Eastern leaders. And it's very clear that the Arab world, that is the Sunni Muslim world, has very much united around this idea that, look, we will have to go in to Israel, essentially, into the Gaza Strip in order to sort out business there. I think this is the proposed solution. So the Israelis, their animosity towards the native Palestinians and natives of the Holy Land and Palestine itself, it's simply too much for the locals to bear. And so perhaps this is an Arab-Islamic problem that needs to be resolved, because Hamas itself, and you can even note in the recent addresses that Hamas have had towards this Trump's proposed peace deal, right, which Hamas have tentatively accepted, I want to say. But then again, if we recall earlier this year, Conrad, after Trump's inauguration, there was also an accepted sort of ceasefire, right, which was later, of course, overturned because Netanyahu and Keith Kellogg and other people, including, of course, our favorite presidential aide, Steve Witkoff, didn't necessarily agree to certain things with Hamas. So that was quite, a punch in the face, I think, for the Trump administration, at least at that time in its youth. But at this point in time, in late 2025, it does appear, Conrad, that all the parties have come together and sort of agreed that, yes, we will release, we will accommodate the release of these 20 living Israeli hostages alongside the bodies of the 28 deceased from Hamas. And also notice the number of detainees, Palestinian detainees, including, I think it was up to hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinians currently being detained suspected to be collaborators of Hamas. This is after the Israeli already incursion into the Gaza Strip after October 7th, and also detainees from previous conflicts that Israel has had with the Gazan Palestinians. So, in fact, if anything, people are saying that, look, it appears that Hamas is coming out on top, and right-wing media channels, Israeli media channels are reporting that, look, this is a Hamas victory. But I note that if we look over the 20-point peace plan proposed by Trump, there are certain points which I think Hamas simply is not going to comply with. And this is very similar to the proposed peace agreements between Hezbollah and some of the talks about disarming Hezbollah up in the north in Lebanon. If you look at point number 6, it says, once all hostages return, Hamas members who commit to a peaceful coexistence and to decommission their weapons will be given amnesty. Members of Hamas who wish to leave Gaza will be provided safe passage to receiving countries. Now we have to ask the question as to which country will be receiving Hamas, and what happens to those Hamas members who do not wish to be disarmed forcefully, right? So again, Hamas and the Palestinians do not get a Second Amendment, if you understand where I'm going with this, right? And clearly that the Israelis will be the only ones left with any sort of license to power, license for violence and law enforcement capabilities, at least in this new Palestinian state of Gaza. Now, again, this peace plan does not recognize Palestine as a state, so that's not what Trump is proposing here. This is simply a finalizing peace plan in order to accommodate the hostage exchange, to a massive Palestinian exchange, and also to end the current bloodshed, which I think, Conrad, on a general level, we have to say that this is probably a good thing, because clearly the genocide ongoing has led to, some speculate, over 100,000 dead, most likely over 200,000 at this point if we count malnutrition, people dying from lack of hospital care, etc., and just the bodies that will be uncovered from under the rubble of these essentially decimated and completely annihilated suburbs. I think the death toll is going to be counted for months, if not years, ongoing into the future. So it's quite devastating what the Israelis have done to the native Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So we have to kind of welcome this, but at the same time, also note one more thing. If Hamas, for whatever reason, right, if Hamas decide, and in particular the Hamas leader at the moment in Gaza, it's of course no longer the Sinwar brothers who were killed in 2024, and now the singular leader in Gaza at this point, representing the military wing of Hamas, is al-Haddad, the ghost of al-Qassam, that is Abu Suhaib. And al-Haddad depends on whether or not he apparently, just in the last 12 hours, has already agreed to this. Now, the political sort of diplomacy wing of Hamas, which Israel, by the way, tried to assassinate in Doha just over a week ago, has also agreed to this model. So it appears that both wings of Hamas have agreed. And the Hamas itself, they call themselves an Islamic resistance movement. So notice they don't call themselves a party per se. They sort of try to collectivize. They say, look, we encompass the views of all Palestinians. And, sometimes they even go outside of the boundaries of Islam. They sort of open up and allow all members of the Palestinian community, including Christians, to join in the struggle for Palestinian independence. And at this point in time, Conrad, we have to keep in mind that there is a very neat trick in this 20-point peace plan. That is, if Hamas, by some, they've already shown agreeance to it, they've sort of verbally agreed to the proposed peace treaty of Trump and Netanyahu, and they're coming to the table. But if, for example, Israel continues to break the current, I suppose, hypothetical ceasefire, if they continue to kill Palestinians, and Hamas turns around and says, no, we will not be disarmed, and if this peace plan breaks in some way and Hamas is responsible for that, this will give the green light, not just for the Trump administration and to support the Israeli ongoing onslaught in Gaza, but will also assist Israel, give it an eternal pretext to escalate to no end and to complete this Gaza city siege, which has already started over a month ago. So essentially, if you can understand this particular peace plan, it's a very cozy, very nice one, and very sort of welcoming and amicable from Trump. But if, for whatever reason, it all breaks down from this point, it's going to be gloves off from the Trump administration and from Netanyahu. So it's going to be rather bleak if all of this falls through.
No, I completely agree. And as far as the internal Palestinian factions, obviously Hamas is trying their best to respond positively while getting the best thing out of it. Of course, the more radical faction within the Hamas coalition, I think even more openly backed by Iran, is Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And they immediately responded with like a rejection of the proposal. They said there was an Israeli aggression plan and all these sorts of things. Of course, we also saw a response from, basically Palestinian resistance outside of Palestine, who I'm only willing to give that title to Ansar Allah, the Yemeni Houthis. And their immediate response to this, of course, was, to our heroic brothers of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, we say the details of the negotiations do not concern us, for the decision is yours. However, we will continue to honor our commitment. Just as our military support operations began at your request, they will only cease at your request and will be renewed at your request. Your fate is ours, and we stand by your side until victory or martyrdom. Those who have made a mistake will know what the opposite will be. And we've seen more reports of Houthis actually having high-level Iranian air defense systems. They've actually intercepted several of the massive Israeli strikes that have attempted to wipe out even more of the Ansar Allah leadership. We know they wiped out pretty much all of the government cabinet of Yemen at that point, the prime minister and whatnot. So the Houthis are still going strong despite being hit. No one else has been hit harder than them besides Gaza itself. So that is, I guess, admirable of them. Of course, we have a recent statement here from the Palestinian resistance factions. They say, we affirm that the response presented by Hamas to the American proposal is the result of a responsible national stance, which come after in-depth consultations with Palestinian resistance factions to reach an agreement that serves the interest of our people and ensures an end to their suffering and a halt to the ongoing war of extermination against them. We commend and welcome the Arab and Islamic positions, the Egyptian and Qatari mediation, and the Turkish efforts, which have greatly facilitated and contributed to the exceptional efforts to adopt a unified Arab and Islamic position that preserves the rights of our people and hastens the cessation of aggression. Our Palestinian people, who have made so many sacrifices to sit firm in the face of fascist Zionist criminal machine, deserve to see their steadfastness and heroism crowned with outcomes that fulfill their national aspirations for freedom, independence, and an end to the occupation, not by liquidating their cause and stripping them of their rights. We consider the constructive and responsible stance taken by Hamas on behalf of the Palestinian forces and factions to be a cry to the entire world that it is time for this occupation to end from our land and that our people have the right to live a dignified life free from killing, destruction, displacement, and settlement. We emphasize the need for a Palestinian Authority to fulfill its duties and obligations starting now, including the need to hold an urgent national meeting. And so it seems that Hamas, the people in Gaza, the other Palestinians around the area, are willing to sue this. They're willing to collaborate with Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. But we know that Israel has effectively ended Fatah in the West Bank. They closed their bank accounts. They've continued to, the E1 Smotrich plan has been approved. They've separated East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. So Fatah has been, disempowered in many ways. And we know that Trump and Netanyahu have said that Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, can only rule Gaza or even the West Bank if it doesn't undergo extreme reform to stop the extremist elements within it, which again, I don't think, from a Palestinian perspective, anybody that supports Palestine would be willing to describe Fatah and the Palestinian Authority as extreme. If anything, they're willing to take way too much on the chin from Israel. So that's this current state, I think, of the internal Palestinian disputes. But I think let's just read all the points from the plan, unless, of course, there's major changes to this. I think it would be fruitful to just read the entire plan so anybody that isn't willing to read the articles understands it. This is from the BBC, of course. Point 1, Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. I think that's point 1 alone is enough for the Hamas people to be like, okay, we need clarification on this. What does that really mean? Because let's be real, obviously Hamas disarms. I don't think Israel wants Fatah or some kind of Palestinian Authority to have arms either. So we know that there's, proposals that Tony Blair and others would be leading a sort of international coalition. And I think Hamas pretty much outright rejected that already. Point 2, Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of the people of Gaza who have suffered more than enough. 3, if both sides agree to this proposal, the war will immediately end. Israeli forces will withdraw to the agreed upon line to prepare for a hostage release. During this time, all military operations, including aerial and artillery bombardment, will be suspended, and battle lines will remain frozen until conditions are met for the complete staged withdrawal. Of course, that means if you look at a map, we'll probably have the map in the thumbnail. Israel is supposed to withdraw largely just to the outer ring of the Gaza Strip, which is basically what Israel had always occupied even before October 7th. It's not like Palestinians were allowed to run up to the Gaza border with Israel or the fence or anything. Many people were shot for that. But right now, Israel in the past week had succeeded in securing the Netzrahim corridor. So Gaza had been successfully split in half. They had reached the beachhead in Gaza in several places. So they, in many ways, achieved a lot of their military goals conveniently right before the peace plan decides to come into place. Point 4 says within 72 hours of Israel publicly accepting this agreement, all hostages alive and deceased will be returned. Point 5 says once all hostages are released, Israel will release 250 life sentence prisoners plus 1,700 Gazans who were detained after October 7th, 2023, including all women and children detained in that context. For every Israeli hostage whose remains are released, Israel will release the remains of 15 deceased Gazans, which I think the casualties are a lot more than 1 to 15, but I guess that's at least the ratio is somewhat large. Point 6 says once all hostages are returned, Hamas members who commit to peaceful coexistence and decommission their weapons will be given amnesty. Members of Hamas who wish to leave Gaza will be provided safe passage to receiving countries. The only countries that I think would be willing to do that are Turkey, Qatar, and potentially Iran in certain capacities. Maybe that they'll do that for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I mean, maybe Egypt would take these people, but if I was a Hamas member, I wouldn't want to go to Qatar or Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
And Turkey, the Israelis openly said they were thinking about striking Turkey instead of Qatar. So I don't know how safe they really would be in any of these countries. Obviously, point 7, like you said, Dimitri says, upon acceptance of this agreement, full aid will be immediately sent to the Gaza Strip. At a minimum, aid quantities will be consistent with what was included in the January 19th agreement regarding humanitarian aid, including rehabilitation of infrastructure, rehabilitation of hospitals and bakeries, and entry of necessary equipment to remove rubble and open roads. We're going to obviously talk about the Gaza flotilla here in a second, which was intercepted and effectively assaulted by Israeli naval forces, largely violating international law. Point 8 says entry of redistribution and aid in the Gaza Strip will proceed without interference from the two parties through the United Nations and its agencies and the Red Crescent, in addition to other international institutions not associated in any manner with either party. Opening the Rafah crossing in both directions will be subject to the same mechanism implemented under the January 19th agreement. Point 9, Gaza will be governed under the temporary transitional governance of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee responsible for delivering the day-to-day running of public services and municipalities for the people in Gaza. This committee will be made up of qualified Palestinians and international experts with oversight and supervision by a new international transitional body, the Board of Peace, which will be headed and chaired by President Donald J. Trump, with other members and heads of state to be announced, including former Prime Minister Tony Blair. This body will set the framework and handle the funding for the development of Gaza until such time as the Palestinian Authority has completed its reform program as outlined in various proposals, including President Trump's peace plan in 2020 and the Saudi-French proposal, and can securely and effectively take back control of Gaza. This body will call on the best international standards to create modern and efficient governance that serves the people of Gaza and is conducive to attracting investment. So that's sort of the biggest one in the middle of the agreement. Obviously, I don't know if the Tony Blair thing is 100% set in stone. It seems weird that his name specifically would be in the more generalized peace plan, but it's very clear that there are still some people within the Palestinian Authority, I guess, that would like to, wage some kind of war against Israel, or I think probably wage war in the West Bank to stop the occupation there. And I'm assuming the quote unquote reform program is going to be purging all of those people. Point 10 says a Trump economic development plan to rebuild and energize Gaza will be created by convening a panel of experts who have helped birth some thriving modern miracle cities in the Middle East. Many thoughtful investment proposals and exciting development ideas have been crafted by well-meaning international groups and will be considered to synthesize the security and governance frameworks to attract and facilitate these investments that will create jobs, opportunities, and hope for future Gaza. I have a strong feeling that the UAE will be one of the main people involved in that. And if I was Palestinian, I wouldn't want anything to do with the Emiratis at this point. 11 says a special economic zone will be established with preferred tariff and access rates to be negotiated with participating countries. Point 12, no one will be forced to leave Gaza, and those who wish to leave will be free to do so and free to return. We will encourage people to stay and offer them opportunity to build a better Gaza. 13 says Hamas and other factions agree to not have any role in the governance of Gaza, directly, indirectly, or in any form. All military, terror, and defensive infrastructures, including tunnels and weapon production facilities, will be destroyed and not rebuilt. There will be a process of demilitarization of Gaza under the supervision of independent monitors, which will include placing weapons permanently beyond use through an agreed-upon decommissioning. And supported by an internationally funded buyback and reintegration program, all verified by the independent monitors. New Gaza will be fully committed to building a prosperous economy and to peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. 14, a guarantee will be provided by regional partners to ensure that Hamas and the factions comply with their obligations, and the New Gaza poses no threat to its neighbors or its people. Of course, the only quote-unquote threat that is posed to anyone is Israel, so I like the generalization of its neighbors as if it is only about one group of people. 15, the United States will work with Arab and international partners to develop a temporary international stabilization force to immediately deploy in Gaza. The ISF will train and provide support to vetted Palestinian police forces in Gaza and will consult with Jordan and Egypt, who have extensive experience in this field. This force will be the long-term internal security solution. The ISF will work with Israel and Egypt to help secure border areas along with newly trained Palestinian police forces. It is critical to prevent munitions from entering Gaza and to facilitate the rapid and secure flow of goods to rebuild and revitalize Gaza. A deconfliction mechanism will be agreed upon by the parties. Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza. This is point 16. As the ISF establishes control and stability, the IDF will withdraw based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization that will be agreed upon between the IDF, ISF, the guarantors, and the United States, with the objective of a secure Gaza that no longer poses a threat to Israel, Egypt, or its citizens. Practically, the IDF will progressively hand over the Gaza territory it occupies to the ISF, according to an agreement they will make with the transitional authority until they are to withdraw completely from Gaza, save for a security perimeter presence that will remain until Gaza is properly secure from any resurgent terror threat. 17, in the event Hamas delays or rejects the proposal, the above, including the scaled-up aid operation, will proceed and the terror-free areas handed over from the IDF to the ISF. 18, an interfaith dialogue process will be established based on the values of tolerance and peaceful coexistence to try and change the mindsets and narratives of Palestinians and Israelis by emphasizing the benefits that can be derived from peace. 19, while Gaza redevelopment advances and when the Palestinian Authority reform program is faithfully carried out, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, which we recognize as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. 20, the United States will establish a dialogue between Israel and Palestinians to agree on a political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence. So point 19 there is basically the U.S. carrot on top of the stick saying, if you implement all the plan above, maybe we will consider recognizing a Palestinian state. And we remember, of course, at the latest UN Assembly, the U.S. and Israel were openly saying that the current Palestinian recognitions by the UK, France, Belgium, Portugal, all these other countries, Canada, was a total victory for Hamas. I guess the idea being that because the Palestinian Authority isn't in power in Gaza, it's a victory for Hamas, despite the fact that all of the recognitions by these countries openly said the Palestinian Authority is the only legitimate authority in Gaza and in Palestine. So there's the peace plan for you. Those are the current details. Obviously, Gaza right now is still only recently in the past hour or so did Israel stop bombarding Gaza. They killed several children in a pre-designated safe zone after Trump had demanded the ceasefire. So once again, I think Netanyahu just likes showing that he ultimately can do whatever he wants. But I guess that brings us to the Trump-Netanyahu sort of rift, where we all saw the picture of Trump holding the phone, where he forced Benjamin Netanyahu to apologize to the president and prime minister of Qatar and the emir of Qatar, I think, as well. Of course, Netanyahu then had to go on this media circuit claiming that all these stories about how he controls Trump and tells Trump what to do, he had to, I guess Trump made him go on TV and say that that wasn't true. And of course, you saw the address from Netanyahu saying they accept the plan because supposedly, and I'm skeptical that it was this harsh in person, Trump told Israel that if they don't accept the plan, we walk away from you. And if Trump walked away from Israel, Iran could destroy Israel. Everybody knows that that is the case, because if it wasn't for the THAAD missile defense systems that the U.S. continues to expand their deployment of in Israel, then we all know that Iran could easily be victorious and drive this parasitic country from the river all the way back into the sea where they belong. But we're going to discuss Iran in a second. Obviously, a lot of the peace deal, I think, resonates with and is coming in conjunction with the plans to disarm Hezbollah. This is from Reuters. It says U.S. sends $230 million to Lebanon as it moves to disarm Hezbollah. U.S. President Donald Trump's administration approved $230 million for Lebanon security forces this week as they push to disarm the once powerful armed group Hezbollah, sources in Washington and Beirut said. A Lebanese source familiar with the decision said the funding included $190 million for the Lebanese armed forces and $40 million for the internal security forces. So they're really trying to push for total Hezbollah disarmament. We saw recent comments from the head of the Iranian Quds Force, who said that the 66-day war between Israel and Hezbollah was one of the most intense and greatest battles we've seen in a long time. And I think it is true that if Israel hadn't, managed to reach the ceasefire deal with Hezbollah at that point, that they would have faced some serious, serious problems in the north of their country. So it's clear that Trump and Israel are doing their best right now to secure the realm in Israel's south, secure the realm in Israel's north. And of course, Trump did supposedly, and the UAE also probably had a great influence on this, draw a line against the massive West Bank annexation. But ultimately, once the Iran war kicks off again, which I think that it will, I wouldn't be surprised if the Israelis go right back into the West Bank. But Dimitri, what are your thoughts on the full peace proposal, Lebanon, before we perhaps talk about the Iranian snapback sanctions and the JCPOA?
No, it's very clear to me that this is probably Trump's final attempt at peace in the Middle East, at least between the Israelis and the Palestinians at this point. We don't know what Trump's future proposed projects will be for Iran. At the moment, there is a sort of standstill. There's no more sort of peace discussions or nuclear technology discussions between Iran and the United States. So that's, I think, even probably more important for the greater geopolitics of the region. But clearly, the dissatisfaction of just the American public seeing dead children, etc., and just seeing that the conflict itself was very one-sided. Like, out of the 2 years of it, perhaps the most egregious acts committed by Hamas or only occurred in the first week, October 7th and onwards, and then thereafter it was clearly just a one-sided slaughter of tens of thousands, completely incalculable numbers of Palestinians. And it's very obviously clear, I think, and even outside of the Trump administration itself, that just for the American general public, the sort of message pushed by famous journalists like Tucker Carlson, et cetera, and despite all the, the presence of a philo-Semitic and, let's just say, pro-Zionist lobby in the US media sphere, in the alt media space, for example, that the media has been turning away from essentially being exclusively pro-Israel. And now the pro-life position has sort of won over, and Trump is just trying to sort of appeal to that. But it's very interesting that the flotilla, in fact, also being seized. I'm not sure if the two events are somehow co-linked here, because on one hand, this is the largest aid flotilla we've seen in a very long time. And, the seizing of over 500 activists, arresting them all. I'm surprised. Again, we sometimes take it for granted that we don't appreciate the fact that Israel does have essentially quite a big navy. If you recall, a month ago, I think it was on the 8th of September, when the attack on the flotilla took place in Tunisia, it was Israeli submarines that, in fact, came up out of the water, and they launched those drones to attack the Tunisian port to try and stop the flotilla sort of early on in its tracks. And now that these 40 ships were essentially seized by the Israeli Navy and essentially taken into, all these activists and protesters were taken into custody, including Greta Thunberg and some European politicians as well, including Nelson Mandela's grandson. So it's very clear, like, the Israelis are trying to keep the ball sort of in their court. They're trying to remain in charge of the status quo to show that, look, the Hamas are still terrorists. Aid cannot be provided until they meet our conditions. They're trying to remain in control and frame this in a particular light. They can't, for example, show to the average Israeli person who, again, there's a huge liberal wing in Israel, of course, so mostly centered around the Supreme Court of Israel, which is essentially their high court as well. And so the liberal left wing is very critical of Netanyahu for trying to reform the entire, shall we say, separation of power system in Israel. And they're trying to essentially see if they can get him out. And Netanyahu is trying to keep the framing as this is a major counter-terrorist offensive in Gaza. It's not a humanitarian crisis. This is why you see most of the Zionist talking heads, including, for example, people from the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, they're also keeping that particular framing. Stopping the flotilla from even reaching Gaza's shores sort of sustains that narrative. But the craziest thing is, of course, Conrad, is, people like Ben Gvir, we've seen him very actively, one of the most demonic members of the Israeli sort of right-wing political space at the moment, sort of walking among the cells, actually saying that, look, this is what happens when you try and enter Israeli waters. And look, Israel is independent, strong. And it's just quite interesting how they were making fun of these activists. And also, all of the European diplomats and all the European politicians, the lawmakers that joined this flotilla were actually sent from Israel. I believe it was from one of the Tel Aviv airports directly back to Europe. But the regular activists were left in these prison cells. So it'll be very interesting to see their interviews and their portrayals of the Israeli justice system once they're all released. But clearly, the point of all of this was to keep the aid and keep the focus on Hamas, rather than on the suffering native Palestinians who are actually dying on the ground. Because, again, to sort of frame all the Palestinian people as supporters of Hamas, I think this was the main message of the Israeli war system since the 7th of October. And they've done this before, Conrad. They remember published videos of Palestinians cheering, and I'm not sure if those videos were in real. You can find them on the internet, of Palestinians cheering after 9/11 terror attacks that took place in 2001. So those videos were actively publicized, and especially among Israeli media, to sort of show that, look, the Palestinians are supporters of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, etc. But now we know the war on terror framing is completely thrown off board, especially since last week's analysis, Conrad, of the UN General Assembly, the annual 80-year anniversary, when Ahmed al-Sharaa essentially gave his speech. And yeah, that was very clear to us that the entire war and terror narrative has gone completely off the rails. And I think Trump is sort of putting a conclusion to this. If this conflict ends as you rightly said, with Hamas, essentially the most militant members of it being transported safely somewhere to either the Hejaz, to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, for example, or even to Turkey. And essentially Hamas just sort of melts and disappears over time. Perhaps this could be that one phase in world history where essentially Islamic terrorism really disappears off the face of the earth. So, for example, we have complete normalization of the Taliban in Afghanistan. We have ISIS more or less defeated at the moment. Hamas seems to be the last remaining so-called Islamic terrorist organization alongside Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is more or less normalized with the Lebanese political system itself. So, in fact, the specter of Islamic terrorism may disappear if Hamas go along with this particular narrative. But we all understand that Islamic terrorism as a political reality only appeared after the US, again, alongside Pakistan, supported the Mujahideen, these Islamic freedom fighters in Afghanistan during the Cold War in the first place. So from the very beginning, this was a geopolitical, the factor of Islamic freedom fighters, Islamic rebellion, etc. It was a geopolitical tool from the start. And 60 or 50 years later, for it to finally sort of end with the death of Hamas, with the defeat of Hamas, it'll be a sort of very interesting chapter. And again, if we look at the conclusions of this entire conflict, Conrad, so say hypothetically it does end in the next week, October 7th on the anniversary, on Putin's birthday. And of course, President Putin openly supported at his recent Valdai speech, which we will discuss later on in this episode. It's very clear to me that Russia is also very strongly in support of this. So it shows that Putin's, again, he's trying to bring around the pro-Trump message to say, look, we're pro-potentially ceasefire discussions with Ukraine. If Trump seems to accommodate our demands, we are pro-peace between the Gazans and the Israelis. Putin is very much putting on this face of diplomacy. And despite all the angered messaging of J.D. Vance and other political leaders within America towards President Putin, it's very clear that he is taking a very pro-Israeli stance, unfortunately, in this particular picture. But in conclusion, I think, Conrad, we can definitely say that Israel has gained in the last 2 years. Not only has Syria been beheaded and essentially, we can say, politically annihilated, Israel has expanded into Lebanon. Hezbollah, at least its leadership, has been largely dealt with. Militarily speaking, Israel survived the 12-day war of Iran, which was, I think, a huge benefit for it in the long term, because for the first time, the Iron Dome was actually tested. And now Israel can sort of correct itself and perhaps even request more military aid from the US to sort of patch any holes in its domestic defense system. Israel clearly, they benefit, according to their own religious beliefs, from the massive genocide of the native population of the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. There's been a huge expansion of settlements, both in the Golan Heights as well as in the West Bank itself. Israel is the beneficiary of all of this, unfortunately speaking. So the last 2 years, whatever Hamas was planning from the beginning on October 7th, and recently we've had an Iranian general come out very openly and say that, look, we actually, officially, we haven't had any record of Hamas contacting us and trying to coordinate the October 7th attack, the Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And in the end, Conrad, maybe if this Operation Al-Aqsa Flood does end after 2 years, right, and we can finally come to a conclusion as to what exactly was this all about, it'll just seem like an overall Israeli victory, both for manslaughter of the native Palestinian population, which they win over, and in terms of actually achieving their ends and expanding their territory, and of course moving further and closer towards the Greater Israel project. So I'm not trying to be pessimistic about it. I think we'll just have a very sober outlook if this 20-point peace plan of Trump actually succeeds and Hamas comes to the table.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much my perspective as well. Obviously, the idea that the Israelis are going to actually withdraw the way that they're going to withdraw, I'm still dubious of, right? But in theory, if Trump is meaning his threat that he's going to cut them off, I guess they would have to. But I'm very dubious that there's really any mechanism within America at all that would allow our current defense system to actually cut ourselves off and isolate Israel. I think there's people within the military, people within the State Department that would effectively just have a coup and resist Trump in doing that, much like they resisted Trump on his immigration agenda and other foreign policy agendas in his first term. And we're even seeing reports right now that apparently Larry Ellison vetted Marco Rubio for the role of Secretary of State and for being adequately pro-Israel. We're going to get into the Larry Ellison Jewish media retakeover here pretty soon, but we do have to discuss Iran. Obviously, on Thursday, Israel still killed in less than 24 hours 53 Palestinians in Gaza in the south. And again, only just within mere hours of us starting this recording did they actually stop killing people. And right now, Israel The Prime Minister's office has instructed all ministers and Knesset members to stop giving interviews to the press. And this is from Israeli Channel 11. Prime Minister Netanyahu held an emergency situation assessment tonight with the participation of a limited number of ministers, senior military leaders, and the negotiation team without the presence of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And of course, I think Netanyahu is afraid that if they accept the deal, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will pull out of his government. There will have to be some kind of snap elections, and Netanyahu will then be on the chopping block again, not just for being forced out of office, but then potentially going to prison and being prosecuted for any number of corruption charges and other things that the Israeli left have been going after him for, losing his prime ministerial immunity. Of course, we know through all the hearings, Netanyahu always finds a reason he has to leave and go consult the war cabinet because of the war going on and not complete, his hearings. Before I get into Iran, there's new stuff breaking as this goes. There's some details about the negotiations expected to resume in the coming hours. The Israeli delegation will not go to Qatar due to the clear tension. Negotiations are set to take place tomorrow in Cairo, so that's Sunday. Steve Witkoff will be attending for the American side, Ron Dermer, Minister of Strategic Affairs for the Israelis. In Israel, work is currently underway on several requirements for the talks, including IDF withdrawal maps that need to be agreed upon. Senior Israeli officials are involved in the talks held last night say that Israel did not interpret Hamas's statement as Trump did and do not see it as consent to the move. According to them, Trump left Israel no choice but to treat Hamas's statement as one that allows dialogue. Today, Israel still views Hamas's response to Trump's plan as negative. Senior officials in Israel said today that the event will be resolved one way or another within days. Either the event will be closed and the release of hostages will begin, or there will be a return to intense fighting. After the IDF halted the operation in Gaza City under the direction of the political echelon, IDF spokesperson Avichai Adre warned the Gaza residents in Arabic against returning to the northern Gaza Strip. IDF forces are still surrounding Gaza City, and returning there is very dangerous. Avoid returning north or approaching IDF operational areas anywhere. So it's very clear that we might be getting some hostage exchanges and negotiations, but it seems that both sides might very much be willing to take up arms once that is done, because I think in many ways, if all these Israeli hostages are released, Israel can just wipe out everybody, completely destroy all of Gaza without any worries. And perhaps the Palestinians and Hamas feel that if they get enough of these hostages and people back, maybe they'd be able to rally some kind of new counteroffensive. I really don't know. But again, most of those people being released will be women and children anyway. That, I guess, they'd be released to then just be immediately slaughtered by Israel again. I don't really know what Israel plans to do with that, but it wouldn't surprise me. But we have to move on to, of course, the number one sort of financier of the anti-Israel axis of resistance, and that is, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is from Dave DeCamp on antiwar.com. It says, U.S. demands of Iran make another war likely. The Trump administration is committed to ramping up the pressure on Iran, the Washington Post has reported, and the demands that the U.S. is making of Tehran make another U.S.-Israeli war on the country more likely. According to the report, the U.S. is demanding that Iran accept 4 conditions as a baseline for negotiations, including committing to meaningful and direct talks, agreeing to end its uranium enrichment program, imposing curbs on its ballistic missile program, and ceasing funding of its allies in the region. Before the 12-day war, Iran made it clear it wouldn't end its uranium enrichment altogether, although it was willing to reduce its enrichment to much lower levels and was exploring the idea of an enrichment consortium involving other regional countries. But those negotiations were abruptly ended when Israel launched the war on June 13th, 2 days before Washington and Tehran were set to hold another round of talks. In the wake of the U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign, Iran has maintained that it won't give up its nuclear enrichment program, framing it as a matter of national pride. Iranian officials have also made it clear they will never accept a deal that would impose limits on its ballistic missile program, since the weapons are the only real deterrent Tehran has. The Post reports come after the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on Iran under the snapback mechanism under the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which was triggered by France, the UK, and Germany. Both Iran and Russia have rejected the reimposition of the sanctions as illegal, pointing to the fact that the US quit the nuclear deal back in 2018. I know China also agrees with Iran and Russia on that statement. Arab officials told the Post that they're worried about another war coming. The region today cannot go through the same Iranian-Israeli war or the other wars of the last 2 years. The cost is too high, a senior Arab government official told the paper. It's always the cowardly Arabs, the Persians, even the Houthis, who I guess are somewhat Arabic, but a little bit different. They're willing to go all in here. They're willing to go. In their mind, they're like, well, we have all these weapons. Why wouldn't we launch them all at Israel? And the Arabs are like, no, please. We like our gay cities, our modern cities and everything. We need this. Anyway, it finishes. Israeli officials have been threatening that another attack on Iran may come soon. We're monitoring what is happening across the Middle East and in Iran and are preparing for a variety of scenarios and options. One of them is that we may need to act against Iran, a senior IDF official told the Israeli newspaper Mariv on Monday. And so we've heard reports supposedly that Israel now knows the location of Iran's enriched uranium, which really, really casts suspicion on Grossi, the head of the IAEA, because mere week and a half after the IAEA is allowed back into Iran, and suddenly now the Israelis know the location of the enriched uranium. The IAEA claims that they weren't told by Iran, but I mean, who really knows, right? If I was Iran, I'd be intensely skeptical of these international organizations. But as far as the potential Israeli strikes, I mean, I don't know what they could do at this point besides try to kill the Ayatollah himself. I mean, I'm sure they could take out the new heads of Quds forces, the new heads of the Al-Qassam, brigades, more of the IRGC stuff and everything. But I mean, anything short of decapitating the Ayatollah himself, I think that would just be a repeat of the 12-day war, which failed to bring Iran to its knees. Obviously, their water crisis is the main thing. So I'm sure Israel will be hoping to lean on that to facilitate some kind of color revolution, most likely with the assistance of their Kurdish and Azeri brothers that have massive influence over the diaspora, minority Kurdish and Azeri populations within Iran itself. But of course, the Iranian supreme leader and the government already issued directives to pretty much every relevant authority figure in Iran that they need to appoint successors and have a plan to continue the government of the country in the case that Israel obviously reignites the war. And again, I do believe at the end of October, potentially in November, we are going to see a resuming of hostilities between these two countries. And if it does happen, it's going to be a lot longer than 12 days, because I think one of the biggest pieces of news about all of this is that Russia has been providing jets and air defense systems almost en masse at this point to the Iranians, something that we had hoped to see before the 12-day war earlier this spring that we had said could happen and didn't happen. But now we're seeing MiG-29s flying over to Iran, dozens of them. Of course, that apparently is sort of a concession that the Russians are giving to the Iranians because the Su-35s have been delayed. I don't know if it's a production issue or a quality control issue, but they haven't been able to get their new Russian newest gen fighters that are quite impressive. So they're getting the MiG-29s, which are obviously sort of the state of the art right now. And we've also seen, of course, S-400s and other very relevant air defense systems, which I don't know if the Houthis have S-400s, but it seems to me that perhaps the Iranians delivered their older air defense systems that have now been replaced by the S-400s to the Yemenis. And that was why they were able to defend against some of those attacks. But in theory, I think the next big thing, obviously the next week, I think is going to tell the tale about Gaza. And then after that, we're going to see a full-throated pivot by the U.S. and Israel. And of course, mostly the Israeli-controlled element within the U.S., talking Marco Rubio and others. Larry Ellison apparently is deeply involved in all of this. I mean, we're going to get into it later. He's appointing, Barry Weiss, ultra-Zionist freak, as head of CBS, which is, a very major news station in the United States. So I think we'll see a full-throated pivot towards Iran at this point. They'll be able to say, we defeated Hezbollah, we defeated Hamas, we've empowered a reformed Palestinian Authority. Now we just have to fully defeat the Houthis, and then we get to the sort of the Hydra itself, Iran, and we will have completely secured the realm. And that is exactly what Dimitri and I said was going to happen in the week after October 7th, when Israel, of course, began its genocide. And it's happened exactly as the Jews have gamed it out. So I guess before we move on to Russia and Ukraine, Dimitri, we need to, what are your thoughts on the future war with Iran? Obviously, Syria, unfortunately, Iran has been largely driven out. And although Turkey is emerging as Israel's new sort of number one enemy, the fact that Israel, of course, has been seemingly somewhat satisfied with Turkey's massive influence increase in Syria itself, I have no confidence in Turkey being able to resist Israel the same way that Iran has been able to. And if Iran is decapitated and Erdogan picks up the mantle of, anti-Zionist emir himself or anti-Zionist Ottoman Sultan, I think within a few weeks we would easily see him assassinated, dethroned, or completely run out of power in a color revolution, which we know Turkish people are very prone to protest. Ekrem Imamoglu, of course, is imprisoned and his support for him continues to grow. So I think we're all awaiting the future big protests or shifts or even more dramatic escalations between Israel and Turkey and other things. But what are your thoughts on this Iran issue, Dimitri? Do you think we're going to be seeing a reignition of the conflict soon?
No, absolutely. I think it's inevitable, really. The Iranian problem for Israel and for the US has not been resolved soon. Iran clearly has some semblance of sovereignty, which really they need to put out this particular flame. And I mean, sort of, symbolically speaking, the Zoroastrian flame needs to die out entirely, of course, in that eastern portion of the Middle East. And they want to put it out by means of their allies. They're assisting Sunni Muslim Shabbos-Goy, in particular, those in Syria, those in Turkey, as you mentioned, those in Azerbaijan, the Shia traitors, Azerbaijan majority Shia country. Nevertheless, Iran at the moment is almost completely surrounded by countries which prefer to collaborate more with the United States rather than with itself. And it has somewhat of an unlikely ally in the face of Pakistan to its east, in terms of Pakistan still opens its trade routes by land to Iran and collaborates with Iran pretty favorably and positively. Note that Iran and Pakistan share similarity in that they both purchase, of course, weaponry and technology from China quite openly. So, and Pakistan's purchase of, for example, Chinese jets recently has really shown sort of its fruits after the Pakistani Chinese jets defeated and the Air Force defeated the Indian Air Force in the recent 5-day war earlier this year. So that was quite notable, I think, during the India-Pakistan conflict, that, of course, the Chinese jets won over the French Rafales. So it's very clear to me that at the moment, Iran really, besides its eastern portion, it faces just a slew of enemies in the West. And Iraq really cannot be considered really an ally. It's very much a destroyed country. The economy is incredibly weak. It's basically been turned into something other than Central African state, with very independent groups, including lots of pro-Iranian cells. And we have to just say that, the IRGC has a huge presence in Iraq. I mean, mostly promoted by General Qasem Soleimani prior to his assassination by President Trump in his first administration. So Iran does have certain positions in the Middle East. That has one of the best spy networks. And of course, Shia Muslims in and of themselves, like religiously speaking, they can pretend to be Sunni Muslims in case of espionage. So it's quite effective what Iran has set up, but they are greatly outnumbered. Of course, they're greatly outfunded. And it does appear to me, Conrad, that, Erdogan, his recent, reestablishment of the steel dome, this anti-Israeli rhetoric, but the meeting of Trump, of course, solidifies his position as the subservient, of course, slave dog of Zog, right? He does have to continue to obey the masters of NATO, right? Europe in particular, and Donald J. Trump in the face of the US. Turkey most likely still seeks to obtain those American F-35 stealth fighters, which it does not have, because remember, the US cut the deal earlier, over 7 years ago. So it's quite contentious, I think, Turkey's position. But of course, Erdogan, he's thinking for himself. He considers the presence of the Kurdish issue, especially the Yazidi Kurds, who are a minority among the Kurdish community, but they're exceptionally supported by Americans and the Israelis, very openly speaking. And even the Sunni Muslim Kurds are, of course, this major factor. So Turkey can be destabilized, as you said, at any point if they ever choose to pursue a more, shall we say, philo-Islamic, independent, sovereign, or some sort of neo-Ottoman project, which goes against the NATO-esque pro-Israeli, pro-Greater Israel status quo. So at the moment, I think Iran is ripe for starting a conflict with. The U.S. Navy is still present. The bombers, as we saw, they literally flew from the U.S. airports, from literally ground-based North America in one night during Operation Midnight Hammer. So really nothing can be left out. In fact, the entire Venezuela subject matter, which we will talk about later on in this episode, Conrad, could be a distraction for an attack on Iran. Like, all of this is, of course, a high possibility. And the fact that Iran is standing its ground in relation to its nuclear independence, really, and spitting in the face of all these international organizations, which, unfortunately have betrayed, I think, Iranian trust. And look, if I was a chief Iranian bureaucrat sort of in charge of these facilities, and I witnessed the assassination of my own citizens and scientists and specialists in these particular key energy areas who just wanted to economically benefit their own country. They weren't actually creating weapons. They were pushing a very novel and effective technology and trying to enhance the life of their Iranian brethren. I would be very angry, and I would push for a very sovereign, right-wing, and definitely reactionary positions to all of this. So we cannot blame Iran for being very hawkish towards its enemies, because Iran here is outnumbered. It has to take a sort of porcupine hedgehog position, and there's no alternative for it. It has to, a strong defense is essentially a good offense. And in the Middle East at the moment, Iran needs to maintain all the leverage that it can get, which means, of course, strong alliance, as you said, with the Houthis, with Hezbollah. Hezbollah needs to remain a threat in the north of Israel in order to keep at least some attention off of mainland Iran. And this is just the reality on the ground. And sadly, unfortunately, Conrad, I think later on in this year, especially after the Palestinian issue will be resolved, I think we may see a continuation of that conflict we saw early in June. And, we'll just have to pray that that just does not happen. But unfortunately, I think the crosshairs are on the Persians here.
No, I completely agree. And I've even heard rumors that the Israeli escalation against Iran will be multi-pronged. Obviously, I think, again, decapitation strikes on the Ayatollah will be attempted, but I think a lot of the attack would be focused on Iraq, because Iraq has continued to be sort of a Shia outpost. The Popular Mobilization Forces have been integrated into the Iraqi forces, so we might see sort of a massive reattack on Iraq, something we haven't potentially seen since, the Second Iraq War began in 2003. So we have to prepare for that. Obviously, they're going to be striking the Houthis. But just quickly before we pivot to Russia, Ukraine, a new Russian document that has been released, it confirms the order of 48 Su-35 fighter jets by Iran. The document from Rosneft Corporation obtained via a cyber attack shows that Iran reportedly placed an order for 48 Su-35 jets. The contract period is 2026 to 2028, with the advance payment being around 15% of the total price of the jets. The document also contains mention of an export contract for 24 L265M10 Kivni M complexes. This modification of the electronic jamming system is designed for Su-35 fighters. They were reportedly ordered in exchange for the establishment of production of Shahed 136 attack drones in Russia. So Russia is paying back, the massive assistance that the Iranian drone industry has given them in Ukraine in kind. And let's be real, if Iran by 2026, unfortunately, it probably doesn't seem like they would get all of the jets until 2028, but let's say they expedited this and by 2026, they do have 48 Su-35 fighter jets. Unfortunately, this document being leaked, that is only going to radically escalate Israel's desire to completely decapitate Iran and destroy any semblance of their air defense and air force that still exists, because the many jets, next thing you know, they could actually be overwhelming the Israeli Air Force. And if, there is serious talk in America about abandoning Israel, which again, I don't really believe there is, but if the Israelis have anxiety about that, then they're going to have even more anxiety if Iran is getting these massive new generation fighters. So let's hope the Russians can make these jets quickly and get them to Iran as soon as possible, and so they can potentially defend themselves against what I believe is a very closely impending conflict. But of course, Russia is not only focused on the Middle East, they're very much focused on their main battle in Ukraine. Of course, I was just in the SMO zone myself, so I guess the reports that I can bring you from the ground are, it did seem to me that while I was there, while there was some of the largest missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, I did not notice any more dramatic movement of armor. However, as I was leaving, I did notice a lot more armored troop carriers, tanks, air defense systems sort of being moved in compared to when we went in the first time. So obviously, I think that is in conjunction with these latest announcements, also from Dave DeCamp here, U.S. to provide Ukraine with intelligence for long-range missile strikes inside Russia. The U.S. will provide Ukraine with intelligence to carry out long-range missile strikes to target energy infrastructure inside Russia, the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday. And obviously, this is Ukraine attempting to respond in kind to what have been the massive, most enormous strikes since the SMO began on Ukrainian energy. We're seeing Sumy Oblast, we're seeing Dnipropetrovsk and all sorts of other regions completely enter blackouts because I think some of these Russian missiles have finally developed ways to evade Patriot systems and are able to strike these very well protected grid sectors much more effectively. And so we saw a huge amount of knockout infrastructure strikes recently that I think is really, really putting the pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainian regime. So they're trying their best to present to their people as if they're going to cause the same level of blackouts in Russia, which of course is completely impossible with the current supplies and the current situation that Ukraine is in. They can maybe strike a few things, but it's not going to equal what Ukraine is currently experiencing right now. This article goes on to say the report said that President Trump recently signed off on the Pentagon providing such support for Ukraine and said that it's the first time the Trump administration will aid such Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia, which always risks a major escalation from Moscow. The report said that while the U.S. has long backed Ukrainian drone and missile strikes, the intelligence sharing means Ukraine will be better able to hit refineries, pipelines, power stations, and other energy infrastructure far from its borders. Last year, the Biden administration backed Ukraine strikes inside Russia, including using U.S.-provided ATACMS missiles, which have a range of up to 190 miles. In response, Russia altered its nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. The news of Trump backing the long-range strikes comes as the administration is considering arming Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of over 1,000 miles, though it's unclear if providing Ukraine with a launcher for Tomahawks is realistic, and sources told Reuters that the transfer of the missiles is unlikely. The Journal report said that the Trump administration is also considering arming Ukraine with Barracudas, air-launched missiles produced by Anduril and other munitions that have a range of about 500 miles. Providing such weapons would mark a significant escalation of the proxy war. In August, the Trump administration announced a weapons deal for Ukraine that will provide the country with extended range attack munition, air defense, air-launched missiles, which can hit targets up to 280 miles away. It's unclear when the missiles will actually arrive in Ukraine. News of the U.S. backing long-range missile strikes inside Russia comes as President Trump has adopted the maximalist approach of his special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, who insists Ukraine can win the war, despite Russia having the clear advantage when it comes to manpower and industrial capacity to produce weapons. And of course, it is true, the official number from the Russian Ministry of Defense is 700,000 troops in the SMO zone, but according to people I talked to there, it's likely closer to 1 million or even potentially more than that. And of course, Russia has fully implemented this new system where it's a combination of volunteers and highly, highly paid free volunteers, as well as highly, highly paid sign-upees, that have signed up to serve, I see all the signs here in Moscow, 5.2 million rubles initially just for signing up, which is enough in Russia to completely change your life if people didn't know the economic situation. So those are the people that are actually at the front in the most intense situations. They've sort of become the new Wagner group. And of course, the other volunteers are sort of in the secondary areas, Zaporozhye front, potentially other parts of Donetsk. I was able to meet with the St. Alexander Nevsky Brigade and do some interviews with them. So again, stay tuned on the Substack and on the YouTube and on the social media for a fully subtitled, translated video of my interviews with these soldiers very, very close to the front line, discussing orthodoxy, discussing their perspective on the war, discussing their perspectives on drone warfare, many other things. Of course, I was able to meet Gabriel Doroshin and do an interview with him. So I cannot stress to you enough how much insane content is coming once I'm able to get back to America, start editing all of this stuff and start releasing it. So please, please, please stay tuned for all of that. But of course, the big news on the front is actually that Dnipropetrovsk is continuing to fall to the Russians as the Russians rapidly advance deeper into that oblast, which again, even according to the Russian constitution, is not part of Russia. And I spoke to people that say that they think the Russian leadership doesn't actually really know what to do as far as governing Dnipropetrovsk. They don't know if they want to prepare it to hold a referendum and elections or if they want to hold it for future negotiations and land exchanges. So I guess leading to that, Dmitry, how are the Russian advances going in Dnipropetrovsk? How are they going in Donetsk Oblast, as well as even Kharkov and some of these other regions?
No, of course, the conflict has very much shifted. If we recall from middle of 2024, in fact, when we looked at the front line, and it had essentially an eastern sector and a northern sector, with the southwestern sector, that is Khersonskaya Oblast, very much in a standstill throughout all of 2024. Obviously, all the attention was on Kursk, Kharkovskaya Oblast, etc. And even Sumskaya Oblast, earlier this year was like a big opportunistic zone, both for the Russians and for the Ukrainians, to try and make certain breakthroughs. But at the moment, it's all the attention is on the east. And it's very interesting that just this week, J.D. Vance released an interview for New York Post where he essentially just mocked the Russians. He said that, look, they're stalling, they have nothing to show for after 3 years. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, he himself has retweeted false numbers of Russian casualties several times actually throughout the year. And he's positioned himself as somebody who has really no idea as to what's happening in that Eastern European theater. If anything, J.D. Vance probably understands more about the Ukrainian church situation rather than what's happening militarily on the ground. And so that's, it's always quite amusing when they try to portray Russia as not being successful on the front lines, when in fact, at the moment, they're making the most progress that they've made in, you can say almost over 2 years, which is very impressive. And in fact, the only particular place where the Ukrainians are still stalling and holding out in a sort of 300 Spartans, Leonidas type holdout is in that small stalagmite type location called the Kliban Byk Vodokhranilishe, which is essentially like the water reservoir we spoke about last week. Apparently there are 80 Ukrainians, many of them actually members of the Azov Battalion, which is currently banned in Russia for being a sort of terroristic neo-Nazi organization. And the Azov Battalion members are actually holding out. Originally, this particular group of armed Ukrainian infantry was numbered around 800, and now there's about 80 of them. So as you can imagine, they're sort of trapped on a sort of land peninsula, isolated on one end by a water reservoir and on the other by the advancing Russian troops. So they're very much like a rat backed into a corner. And there are some sort of subterranean urban developments nearby, so they're obviously using them for defense. And it's a very interesting sort of situation. That's probably the only place where the Ukrainians really are holding out. The Russians are actively using all kinds of methods of assault on all areas of the front line, especially in the east. And if we speak about the northeast in particular, there's been really huge advances towards Kupiansk. Kupiansk hasn't entirely been taken by the Russians, but at this point, it's looking like at least 2/3 of Kupiansk are well and truly within Russian control. But mind you, there are every now and then shifts and back and forths over certain particular blocks of territory, right? So these are buildings and storm groups essentially are taking the city in segments. And again, there is that use of the big gas pipeline, which we spoke about last week, which was incredibly amusing. But the Russians are using this gas pipeline to essentially transport troops from one end of the Kupiansk front to the other. So it's not necessarily like the Avdiivka pipeline, which took the Russian troops all the way into the city itself to kind of emerge on the Ukrainian side and take them by surprise. This particular pipeline is simply for, I guess, the Russian reserves around the the back end of Kupiansk to safely transfer themselves from one end of the battlefront to the other in order to support their comrades. And it's a sort of very intensive conflict at the moment. I think there's easily over 1.5 million men, like armed Ukrainians and Russians combined, located in those last remaining oblasts in both Kharkiv and the Donetsk Oblast. So that's absolutely insane. It's definitely the biggest conflict happening in the world at the moment, and all eyes really are on cities like Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, which is currently being bombed. The Russians haven't reached Konstantinovka yet, but they're still, of course, lobbing bombs at long range, especially at small villages on the outskirts. Notice, Conrad, what they do is the Ukrainians, clearly there's no people living in these villages, but the Russians, they're trying to find, because the Ukrainians, what they do is they enter into these villages, about 20 houses there, and they use some of these village homes in order as drone launch sites. And so the Russians, if they identify one of these villages as such a site, they will just drop a bomb on it, essentially from a plane, sort of an effective method to remove. Unfortunately, of course, there is no really sign or guarantee that civilians won't be hit by either side. But at the moment, the war front, you can see even from a city like Guliai-Polya on the Ukrainian end, the populations are just decreasing. Originally the city had 20,000 people just in 2021 during COVID, for example. Now the city's population is estimated to be less than 2,000 people. Cities like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, civilians have been leaving it for the past 3 years or so, and now they're continuing to sort of stream out of there because of the ongoing, the future anticipated sieging of the city by the Russian forces. So there's clearly enormous progress being made. And of course, the Russians are fighting on all ends. Actually, what's interesting is you have black berets, blue berets, and sort of crimson red berets fighting in the same place. And just for reference, the Russian blue berets are, of course, the WWIII airborne commandos. But as we noted last week, I think I mentioned this, if not, for the last 2 years, Russians have not been dropping airborne commandos anywhere on the front lines from planes or helicopters. There's not been a single operation where the WWIII, and these are considered some of the best elite infantry, just like we saw at Gostomel airport at the beginning of the special military operation, they haven't dropped off any planes. They've actually been fighting on the ground alongside the regular Russian volunteers and infantry soldiers that Conrad, for example, met in the Donbass. So you have the blue berets, you have, of course, the black berets. These are the Russian Marines, so the infantry from the Russian Navy, and in particular the Black Sea Fleet. Because the Black Sea Fleet hasn't really been carrying out any operations, they've sent all of their elite infantry troops. And unlike the American Marines, which number easily over 150,000, right? The Russian Marines are very selective. So the Russian naval infantry is very small. It's somewhere between 10, maybe 20,000 troops. And those troops have been actively spotted in places like the Golden Well, Zolotoy Kolodets, which is where the Russians are currently fighting on essentially 3 fronts. This is in the northeast of Pokrovsk. Unfortunately, the Russians have failed essentially a breakthrough in this area, but now they're pressuring the Ukrainians, and it's really unclear after Zolotoy Kolodets which direction the Russians will attack. And if they break the Ukrainian defenses, they could go east towards Konstantinovka, or they can go to the southwest. So the Ukrainians are very much on the back foot here. And, all of this being discussed, there's also, of course, Russian Spetsnaz operating behind Ukrainian lines, cutting Ukrainian communications and taking out Ukrainian antennae, which are, essentially Ukrainians are putting up these big radio antennae in civilian populations. So these huge, and they're almost impossible to spot. So, which is when you see drones and missiles hit essentially suburban buildings, most likely it's because the Russians have spotted a secretive or at least covert Ukrainian communication outpost. So this is probably why you see like missiles hitting, essentially long-range bombs hitting suburban buildings, for example. So there's reasons for these things, because otherwise the bombs would they would outprice the building itself. So there's considerations here. It's not just war against the civilian population. And you can clearly say that for either side. But of course, huge progress in Dnipropetrovsk. Every single week, actually, there's been between 5 and 10 Ukrainian villages taken by the Russians and no gains by the Ukrainian side. As the Russians progress into Dnipropetrovsk, the threat arises, Conrad, as essentially the front line is so vast. And, you've seen the landscape yourself. It's just plains. It looks like Africa. You can just view kilometers away. It's a huge landscape. You can't necessarily defend it properly. And if you attack in a massive wave, and of course, you demine the particular areas, the question arises, can the Ukrainian drone defense system, which they've relied on, for more than a year now, almost exclusively, can that really hold the success of the Russian forces as they besiege multiple cities at this point, and as they progress literally on every single front, including in Zaporozhye, in the, of course, the northwest of the Zaporozhye Oblast, approaching Zaporozhye city itself? Because if, God forbid from the Ukrainian perspective, and I doubt very much that they've actually reinforced Zaporozhye city as much as they've reinforced, say, Kramatorsk or Slavyansk or even Pokrovsk. We've not heard of any, crazy defense fortresses being built in Zaporozhye ever. If Zaporozhye falls, right next door you have Dnipro, you have the, Menorah Center, for example, the Rose Synagogue. You're already hitting like sort of key areas of Ukrainian decision-making, shall we say, the covert, globalist centers of power. So it's very interesting. The prospects are quite amazing. So, of course, we're keeping all the brave Russian troops in our presence, of course, keeping the both innocent Russians and Ukrainians in their presence, especially those caught amidst this massive conflict currently happening in Eastern Europe. But despite all of this, there's been somewhat independent reporting, actually. People have tried to assess how effective the drone strikes are from both Russians and Ukrainians, given that every single day the drones, as we said, have escalated. There's between 300 and 400 drone launches and successful strikes by either the Russians and the Ukrainians every single day of the week, which amounts to thousands of drones being launched on a weekly basis. So between, I suppose, our World War Now recordings, there are thousands of drones either hitting their target or being shot down. And what's really curious is that these independent journalists, in particular Shiryaev, who I wouldn't say is pro-Russian at all, he essentially stated that the Russians are hitting, for every one Ukrainian successful drone strike, the Russians are hitting 7. And this is, the drone technology obviously is continuing to develop. For example, you have long-range drones that fly for a few hundred kilometers, and then they translate the signal onto another drone. And it's essentially, you have this domino system of drones translating almost like a router, one drone routing the signal to another, to another, to another. And you have a chain of drone transmissions, essentially allowing them to travel for thousands of kilometers. And of course, amidst all of this, Conrad, you do have that covert Russian End Doom radio station constantly signaling and playing, essentially, those covert words are being passed on. It's being tested out of the Leningradskaya Oblast, which is next to St. Petersburg. It's been operating essentially nonstop since our previous, I think, 2 Q&As ago, someone asked the question, like, why is the radio station, it's just started talking this year in 2025 very actively. And it's like, yes, it has. In fact, it's been passing on key signals. And amidst all these massive drone strikes against Russian key cities, St. Petersburg, for example, is always a target. Moscow, there's drones flying essentially through demilitarized Russian zones like Voronezh, for example, and even Rostov-on-Don. You have always the threat of Russian long-range retaliation. And, this recent reporting, I have to just comment on the fact that the Ukrainians attempting to request officially these Tomahawk missile systems, alongside, of course, the 16 or 17 Patriot systems. This is something that really people haven't taken into account. So keep in mind, when we talk about Tomahawks, traditionally, for example, we think of the George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton years when Tomahawks were used primarily from the U.S. naval ships and submarines. But these days, at least recently, I think it was around 2020, Lockheed Martin developed a Typhon system. And the Typhon system essentially are these land-based Tomahawk missile launchers, which are positioned on top of these 8-wheeler trucks. And essentially it turns it into something akin to an S-400 missile launcher. It looks like a Patriot system. Looks very similar to a THAAD, for example, physically at least. And they've tested this in the Philippines. So, and of course, the Philippines is about 1,300 kilometers from China. So just in range of course, the Patriot missile launchers. And of course, the Philippines having Patriot missile launchers is incredibly dangerous for the Chinese, a constant sort of state of pressure. And just keep in mind just in range of these Tomahawk missile launchers. And of course, the Philippines having access to land-based Tomahawks is incredibly agitating and dangerous for China. And you can kind of see the same level of threat for the Russians because, as you said, Conrad, these Tomahawks easily fly 1,000 miles. They're equivalent to the Russian Kinzhal system, except the Kinzhal, from what we know, is hypersonic. It's a bit faster than the Tomahawk, and it's primarily shot similar to the British missile systems. It's shot out of from a plane. So the plane carries this 4,000-kilogram bomb and essentially launches this missile, right? And the missile flies at its target at a very incredibly fast speed, almost impossible to hit. I think we've heard of maybe 2 times the Patriot U.S. air defense system has shot down a Kinzhal missile in the entire Ukrainian war. And those reports are somewhat biased pro-Ukrainian. So they're very happy they shot down a Kinzhal missile system, which, is somewhat unprecedented. So you kind of have to consider if the Ukrainians ever got a hold of these Typhon systems, on top of these big 8-wheeler trucks, they have Tomahawks installed. They could reach potentially Moscow and other cities inside of Russia very easily, including the Rostov-on-Don, the southern Russian command center, which is, very, very close. Especially if they position it somewhere along the Dnieper river system. Obviously, they won't bring it into Kramatorsk or Slavyansk. It'll be a prime target, even for Russian Sukhoi jets, for example. But it's very dangerous, a huge escalation. We don't know if this will happen. Again, it's one of these sort of military geopolitical rumors, Conrad, similar to the one where we discussed last week, where apparently Israel was at least giving certain Patriot systems to Ukraine, which is, I think, somewhat insane. And, potentially the signaling from Putin recently, his somewhat pro-Israeli comments about, how he wants there to be peace between the Palestinians and Israel. And maybe he's trying to signal that, look, we're actually not anti-Israeli here. We're fighting a different war, primarily against NATO. Israel isn't in NATO. We don't want Israel to support Ukraine militarily, technologically, etc. So who knows where all of this is going. But at the moment, the Russians are making, uncharacteristic progress in terms of this war overall, incredibly successful. And all the land grabbing that the West is accusing Russia of doing, essentially, you just have to consider it. Look, they don't say the same about Israel. The double standards and hypocrisy applied to the special military operation when, of course, Israel is allowed to do the same against their perceived enemies is completely out of pocket. So we just have to think of it as when the final ceasefire/peace talk discussions come up, the high likelihood is that all of these villages taken in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and the Sumskaya Oblast, for example, will essentially be given back to Ukraine, if it, of course, remains to be a sovereign state at the end of all of this. And they will simply be traded for certain Russian territories, which the Russians consider their own, constitutionally speaking. So this is probably the most moderate, I would say, opinion we could have of the Russians actually progressing into these unprecedented territories, right? So generally speaking, the Russians are making great progress across the entire front lines. It's really sort of surprising in a way that every single week is growing successes across the entire SMO zone.
No, like I said, we're all awaiting sort of the emergent Russian strategy on how they're going to handle these larger cities. And of course, now that I've been to Donbass, I've been to Donetsk, I've been briefly inside the Lugansk region, not the city itself, but across the border, I noticed the landscape. And of course, it makes perfect sense why Lugansk has been able to secure itself much easier than Donetsk. It's much hillier. It's farther east into Russia. I took some beautiful photos with the Alexander Nevsky Brigade on the Donetsk-Lugansk border, these amazing golden rolling hills with this lake and these swans on it. I was actually shocked at how beautiful the Donbass region actually is. I was sort of just expecting flat, blown out buildings and craters from missile launches, but there's rivers, there are some hills in the farther eastern parts of it. And, the steppe itself is very beautiful as well as all the forests there. So I was a bit stunned by the natural beauty. And of course, like you said, Dmitry, Dnipropetrovsk continues to be where the front advances. And I'm going to bump up a church news story up into the war section of the episode here because it's very much related. And I was able to see dozens of churches that at one point were at zero, which is like the front itself where the two sides effectively meet within the gray zone. And so many churches at one point were sort of the dividing line where Russian and Ukrainian troops were on either side. I'm going to be releasing a lot of videos showing, tangible real evidence about how the Ukrainians have always had less concern for the churches, both architecturally and the well-being of Christian people there. And I think in some cases have viewed the destruction of churches as sort of a de-Russification and a necessity to potentially retaking some of these territories. Many of the volunteers from America and the West that come to fight for Ukraine are Satanists. They're part of this 764 Order of Nine Angels sort of ilk, and they obviously fit in very well with some of the more paganistic, satanic forces within Azov and with other Banderite type groups within Ukraine. But a big story, of course, on September 30th, 2025, on the Feast of the Holy Martyrs, Faith, Hope, and Love and their mother Sophia, the main sacred treasure of the Holy Iveron Convent, returned to its home after 11 years. The Iveron icon of the Mother of God, known locally as the Donetsk Portatissa, was painted in 1999 by a monk of the Russian St. Panteleimon Monastery on Mount Athos at the request of ever-memorable Schema Archimandrite Zosima, that's Elder Zosima of Donbass that we've talked about extensively on the show before. After its completion, it made a ceremonial journey through many churches of Donbass before being installed in a newly built church the same year. Before the events of 2014, the icon was housed in the Iveron Convent, where pilgrims from many cities came to venerate it. The monastery is located near Donetsk Airport, which became the site of fierce fighting. During the military operations, the flourishing monastery was heavily damaged by shelling. The nuns protected the icon, but in September 2014, after the monastery sustained severe damage, it was transferred to the St. Nicholas Cathedral in Donetsk. The sisters were also evacuated. The icon's return was preceded by a grand procession through the Donetsk and Gorlovka dioceses from late June through Late September, thousands of faithful had the opportunity to venerate the miraculous icon, reports Donbass Orthodoxy. And I was at this event on Tuesday morning. I attended this hierarchical divine liturgy in the monastery building, which again, the dome and all the cupolas on top of it are completely destroyed. If you go inside, there's a plywood ceiling to keep the rain out so people can worship inside of it. And so a story that, again, I haven't seen any of the Donbass news agencies talk about this. Ortho Christian doesn't talk about this. I've been asking all of the camera people that I know. I've been asking Andre and other people that I know there to try to get some kind of footage, because I know at least one person that was there was filming the entire thing. So the footage has to exist, but I don't know why they aren't reporting on it. Maybe the people of Donetsk are just so desensitized to this stuff that it didn't interest them. But about 2/3 of the way through the service, a Ukrainian missile struck like 500 meters away from the church in effectively an empty graveyard. And people I talked to afterwards, they said the only thing they could have been doing was potentially trying to strike the service itself and assassinate. Of course, Metropolitan Vladimir of Donetsk was there. He's like 6'10", 6'11". He's just a massive individual. He was there with 2 other bishops. 35 plus priests were there, and then a huge, of course, cohort of parishioners, as well as a Russian National Guard that were there for security purposes. Huge amounts of media from major Russian news channels were there. I obviously got a lot of footage from it. I wish somebody had the footage where we can hear the explosion nearby and the shaking of the church, because I think it would be really relevant, and a lot of people in the West would really understand the evil of the Ukrainians. I do have a video as we walked into the monastery of a Ukrainian drone flying overhead, I guess destined for a different target, but that was only somewhat disconcerting. During the video taking I was doing in Donbass, I captured multiple Russian jets, buzzing over us, returning from missions. So that was quite fascinating. We also even saw a Russian air defense intercept a Ukrainian drone in the sky at dusk just over our heads as we were driving back into Donetsk from Gorlovka. Of course, we also went to Gorlovka, the long-suffering city. I was able to conduct the first journalistic interview ever, including Russians, Westerners, all journalists, with Metropolitan Mitrofan of Gorlovka. In my opinion, a very pious bishop. He showed us around his cathedral. He's a heavy venerator of the Romanov royal martyrs, a deep, deep respecter for Imperial Russia. And he even had a collection in his office of holy items, reliquaries that had been damaged by a Ukrainian fire. There were even reliquaries that shown that at close range, Ukrainians had fired bullets directly into the reliquaries after entering churches, and it just openly evil, terroristic, demonic activity. So yes, I was safe in Donbass. However, effectively, the Ukrainians did try to kill me, the Metropolitan, Andre, 35 plus priests, 2 other bishops, with what some suspect was potentially a French missile that struck a graveyard 500 meters away. So that was quite the experience. It even sounds surreal recounting it to everybody. And I'm stunned that none of these Donetsk or Donbass news outlets have published this, and I still haven't been able to nail down any footage that has the audio in it. It's sheer luck that I wasn't filming. I filmed like half the service myself, just trying to see all the beautiful vestments and everything that was happening and the beautiful chanting all inside this like bombed out monastery that, despite being effectively destroyed, never stopped services. The sisters never stopped doing their work. I went to another monastery, Nikolskaya, founded by Elder Zosim of Donbass, and was able to venerate Elder Zosima's grave. Of course, he prophesied effectively the entire Ukraine war right now. In the late 90s, he was telling his spiritual children that the Banderites were going to come. He told them, you need to bury me as deep in the ground as possible so that these people, when they occupy our lands, won't be able to dig me up and desecrate my corpse. He talked about all sorts of things that have to do with this, and about perhaps we'll even do an entire episode, Ether Hour, in the next few weeks on Elder Zosima of Donbass, because I've been sent a lot more material on him in Russian that hasn't been translated into English yet. So we're going to be going through that, and I hope he can continue to bless us on our show. And I hope as well that the Russian church, hopefully, I think in the next 5 years, it's been over 20 years at this point, I think it's safe that we can canonize this man who has undoubtedly exhibited extreme spiritual fruit, and is undoubtedly, I think, much like Saint Philomenos protected and guided his monasteries from Israeli attacks. I think Elder Zosima is largely behind a lot of these liberations and the revitalization of monastic life in these unfortunately now bombed out monasteries. But at the Nikolskaya monastery, right next to the little chapel where Elder Zosima himself is buried, we went into the huge cathedral, which is a 1/9 scale replica of the Uspensky Cathedral at the Kremlin, where, of course, the czars were coronated. It's a beautiful, beautiful cathedral. And despite having very blatant, massive tank shelling holes where Ukrainians fired tanks directly into the wall of the church, for some reason, despite effectively, the angle of these things, you can see them. They should have smashed directly into the iconostasis after breaking through the outside walls of the church. The iconostasis is completely untouched. It's just as clean and looks just as nice as the Uspensky Cathedral itself in Moscow. And it's clear that through some kind of divine intervention. I would argue Elder Zosimo himself, these tank shells were stopped and just disappeared and fell to the ground right in front of the iconostasis without destroying the beautiful artwork, much like St. Philomenos stopped the Israeli tank shells from destroying St. Fotini Monastery in the West Bank. So I think the saints of our latter days in protecting against military evil, they have sort of an MO. And yes, there are, things that are allowed to happen and persecution is allowed to occur and God permits us to suffer for our own salvation. But, many beautiful things that are around us, I think, are still protected by the saints. And I was able to witness that firsthand in Donbass. So be sure to follow me on X at Conrad. Follow us here on Substack if you want to hear more and more details and see all the videos and the interviews that I was able to do in Donbass. I interviewed the deputy foreign minister of the Donetsk People's Republic. Like I said, I interviewed members of the St. Alexander Nevsky Brigade. I interviewed Gabriel Doroshin. I interviewed volunteers that are rebuilding houses that come from other parts of Russia to rebuild single-family homes that have been damaged throughout the war. I've interviewed some volunteer women that cook food for the troops on the front line. And in general, I think I've contributed in a media way to helping, facilitate more understanding to the West. And maybe if people see some of this stuff, they'll be more willing to pressure their lawmakers and even their church figures to advocate for an end to the United States support for the ongoing conflict, because nothing else was proven to me more than, unfortunately, that U.S. tax dollars go directly to trying to kill Christians that are actively worshiping, trying to destroy holy sites, and trying to continue to purge Holy Orthodoxy from this region. So be sure to keep Donbass in your prayers, keep Donetsk in your prayers. There's still no full-time running water. Half the days of the week you can't take a shower. You have to shower with a bucket, which I had to do once, and it was really cold. But regardless, the people there are very strong, long-suffering, and continue to obviously support, because they were fighting for 8+ years as their own independent country before the Russians came in. So really a truly hardy and brave, and you can see the piety is also increased there. So keep the whole region in your prayers. But unless you have anything else to say about Russia, Ukraine, Dimitri, we do need to talk about Venezuela, because obviously we have more strikes on these little boats off the coast of Venezuela. And we even heard reports this past week that the Pentagon and Trump are apparently approving strikes deep within Venezuela itself to decapitate the regime and facilitate some sort of color revolution.
Yes, of course. Venezuela is at the moment reporting almost on a daily basis U.S. combat planes flying overhead, or near Venezuelan territory, essentially 75 kilometers away, so very much within vision. Of course, these sort of taunting flights, right? Maduro himself and his politicians have essentially described it as essentially a military Hollywood-like show that the US is putting on. And yes, it is very interesting that, we did mention off air, Conrad, that Venezuela is not, despite it being socialistic internally, domestically speaking, it has never rejected Western capitalist corporations from, say, for example, assisting it in exploiting its natural resources, such as gas and primarily, of course, oil, crude oil, especially off the coast of Venezuela itself. And so Venezuela really hasn't isolated to stuff like Cuba and like North Korea. In fact, this is very much a modern socialist sort of country, very much maybe taking, despite being much poorer, taking certain examples from countries like the People's Republic of China. So despite all of this, the recent rhetoric about Venezuelan drug dealers and bringing narcotics into America, which, again, notice there was never a special military operation against Colombia, even during the heyday of the cocaine trade, right? So this is clearly marked by some sort of geopolitical concerns of the Trump administration primarily, because even the Biden administration never signaled nor prepared for this. So this is clearly an operation. And look, there is currently, thousands of American troops just off the coast of Venezuela. American, naval officers, Marines, etc., which we just mentioned, the Russian Marines earlier, but these are American Marines. Who knows what they're exactly preparing for? They're, of course, largely outnumbered. The Venezuelan military, despite, maybe being less trained and less efficient, less effective, there are still Venezuelan elites, of course, on the ground, most likely preparing their, plugging any sort of issues they have with domestic defense. There's clearly a concern for an assassination attempts essentially against Maduro or some sort of coups internally, because the bounty that was put on his head, very criminalistically, by the way, it's almost like a gang putting a hit on an enemy rival mafia leader, for example. The US putting out a $50 million bounty on President Maduro of Venezuela. I mean, this is about as geopolitically Machiavellian as you can get. And it's just very concerning that the US is using its military to exert force against essentially its neighboring country, if we consider like Puerto Rico sort of a colony of America at this point, Conrad. Like, it's just very, very unfortunate that the Trump administration has moved into this. And in recent sort of news, and this is probably just a bit over a week ago now, Pete Hegseth, of course, meets with all the top generals and admirals of the US military and Navy, of course, they conduct Pete Hegseth himself after this sort of behind-the-scenes conversation. We are not really privy to exactly what they were discussing, but people say this was essentially unprecedented. Again, America has hundreds of generals who, many of them really haven't necessarily even seen active combat, but they do work in logistics. The American military-industrial complex is a gigantic machine which needs to be fed, it needs to be led. And this Pete Hegseth at the moment, unfortunately, is really the man in charge. If you compare him, Conrad, really this hardcore Zionist, to Andrei Removich Belousov, the Russian defense minister, it's clearly like two different people. Like Andrei Belousov, of course, attending church, and Pete Hegseth, of course, advocating for Israel's expansion in the Middle East. These are two very spiritually diverse individuals, shall we say. And unfortunately, Pete Hegseth, despite all of this, he does sort of position himself as a member of like the MAGA right wing. So he's against the whole transification of the American military. He clearly spoke out about this very openly. And it's very sad that these sort of conservative principles are being used to essentially fuel the American war effort. It's like, look, we're actually against the LGBTQ alphabet community, we're against trans troops, and this is why the American military is strong. And now, we're going to, as a Department of War, we're going to exert essentially our force against these foreign drug dealers. He says this as a fourth hit against a apparently, allegedly narcotics boat has been conducted just this week. I think it was just over a day ago and Donald Trump shared this post, right? So all these hits against these speedboats somewhere off the coast of Venezuela, conducted by the American warplanes, it appears, are being posted online by American members, members of government, including Donald J. Trump himself, and of course being retweeted by J.D. Vance. So it's very curious as to who exactly is even conducting investigations into these particular boats. It's all very extrajudicial. You would almost think that in some way America is somewhat mimicking Israel in its conducting of strikes against targets which it deems to be necessary. For example, the Damascus Iranian embassy earlier, of course, last year before the government in Syria fell. So it's all incredibly concerning. And despite all of the calls for peace and from the international community in Russia and China saying they're going to be behind Venezuela and potentially, Conrad, I know there's the rumors of Russian, just maybe air defense systems or some sort of defense systems being transferred to Venezuela. We are looking maybe at a renewed sort of quasi-Cuban missile crisis type scenario. And remember, that was one of the hallmarks, including the Bay of Pigs, of course, of the entire JFK Kennedy presidency. And I think since JFK, really, we haven't had a president who's had as much charisma as Donald J. Trump. So there are clear analogies between the two of them, not just, of course, the huge rhetoric in relation to Israel, big talks about escalation in the Middle East, but also just what's happening in the Caribbean and in South America. So all of this, there's clearly a historical analogy, 60 years or so later at this point. So it's all very concerning. And unfortunately, the peace president is now looking to start an entirely almost new war, unless this is a big military exercise of spending of American taxpayer dollars. Because if you recall, the Biden administration made it extremely poignant that, look, Mexico needs to control the fentanyl trade. It was all about Mexico, fentanyl, essentially Chinese fentanyl as well, crossing the border, right, between America and Mexico. And that was one of the biggest sort of highlights of that entire presidency. Now it's entirely shifted. Mexico is no longer an issue. Mayorkas, somehow with the president of Mexico, they've sorted it out. And it all appears to be theater, I think, for the goy slaves that are watching mainstream media, essentially Fox News, CNN. And I think as soon as we see the mainstream media essentially begin reporting about how the Maduro regime needs to fall, just like 24 hours before the Operation Midnight Hammer, Conrad, 24 hours before that, there was literally on Fox News and CNN, there was American generals and military professionals commenting on the fact that, look, we can actually bomb Iran and we can get away with it. And just talking about these Iranian nuclear facilities, almost signaling to the public, to expect certain news to take place. We saw that operation happen earlier this year. So this is just as frightening when we begin seeing the mainstream media getting these big stories from somewhere within the Trump's administration. I think inevitably something will happen in Venezuela, whether it's some sort of precision strike on the presidential palace, whether it's SEAL Team 6 type operation, who knows? I think we can expect really anything from Trump, given Operation Midnight Hammer earlier this year. And I think generally speaking, the entire world will not be really surprised. Trump has really not only positioned himself as like the clown of American politics, he's very much a Joker type character. So he's unexpected. He will do drastic and somewhat outrageous things. And he will, of course, position himself both as peacetime president and as a president of war at the same time. So the sort of dualistic approach makes him very unpredictable. And that's not to say that, Kamala Harris would be any different, but I think Trump having the mandate of the people at the moment is very much in a position to abuse it. And unfortunately, I don't think the American public need any of this. There's so many domestic issues that need to be resolved before America goes into a new war, especially with one of its very close, almost neighboring nations. It's very unfortunate news about the Americas at the moment.
No, it's true. And of course, Russia and Venezuela being close allies, this is much like Cuba was never really about, liberating someone from communism. It was about preventing Russia or enemies of America from putting long-range bombers and missiles within the range of the United States, much like, of course, the U.S. has put in Turkey and in other NATO countries. Venezuela has to be decapitated because as the U.S. attempts to surround and isolate Russia, they can't have this, oil-rich country to their south just, openly having U.S. weapons and even Russian weapons and Russian planes there. So, that's what we're seeing right now. Obviously, Venezuela still makes deals with Chevron, Exxon, these other huge mega corporations. So this idea that this is all about oil and energy is, that's a bit of a leftist attempt to try to justify what's obviously a civilizational conflict between other powers. So we're going to be keeping an eye on Venezuela. Obviously, the latest attack on the narco boat, many people have tried to claim that these are innocent, fishermen or whatever, but I think it has been proven that one of the members of some cartel was on the latest ship. So, I'm not really shedding too many tears over the little boats, but I certainly have no interest in seeing the United States, spend hundreds of millions of dollars and deploy soldiers and continue to deploy these ships to dethrone Maduro, who, again, I'm no fan of, but it's better to approach with Russia than to, engage in even more expanded conflicts just because you refuse to stop funding Ukraine and this other nonsense. But speaking of Russian allies and everything, we have to discuss the Moldovan election. Of course, be sure to check out our free episode of Ether Hour a few weeks ago about the church persecutions in Moldova. Dimitri and I talk extensively about it. I recently recorded a podcast with Buck Johnson about it, as well as my experiences in Donbass. So be sure to watch Counterflow to hear more about that. But of course, the results from the Moldovan election, 50.1% of the vote went to the PAS, Maya Sandu's party. Only two, in the end, PAS, they've won 55 seats in the Moldovan parliament, a drop from the 63 they had in the previous parliament. However, with the entry of parliament of PN and the PPDA, the number of pro-EU members of parliament have grown from 63 up to 67 MPs. So unfortunately, the Moldovan elections did not go well. All the articles online talk about how Russian interference, the Russians tried to interfere with the elections. And, I really didn't see the evidence for the supposed hundreds of millions of dollars that Russia poured into influencing this election. I do know that tens of thousands of people in Moldova were intimidated into not voting, potentially even bribed with cash to not vote in the election. These were from demographics of people that would have obviously voted for the more pro-Russian party. Of course, most people in Pridnestrovia didn't vote and were effectively restricted from voting. And of course, the biggest interference that occurred in previous Moldovan elections, only 2 polling stations in all of Russia were open for the 650,000 person strong Moldovan diaspora there. So in my opinion, this is obviously an illegitimate election. I don't think that Maya Sandu is a legitimate leader of Moldova or that her party accurately represents the people of Moldova. And the main reason I obviously could never support them is because they are facilitating rapid persecution of some of the most pious Orthodox people in the world. I, of course, talked to Archbishop Markel. There's other bishops and priests that I've spoken to there that, unfortunately, after this election, the persecution is only going to get worse. There's even legislation that is attempting to be moved through Parliament right now that would immediately remove 720 or something, effectively half of the 1,400 plus Moldovan Orthodox churches in Moldova to be directly under the state, and then they would then be given over to the jurisdiction of the Bessarabian Metropolia, which is uncanonically impeding on the territory of the Moldovan Orthodox Church, which is led by the Metropolitan of Chisinau, as well as, under the Omophorion of Patriarch Kirill. They are, of course, autonomous, much like Ukraine. They have their own synod. So this idea that, every decision in the Moldovan Church comes from Russia is complete nonsense. Most of the liturgies, the vast majority of the services, of course, under the canonical Moldovan Orthodox Church are conducted in Moldovan, Romanian. There's only one church in all of Chisinau that does services in Slavonic and Russian, and you can hear our story about, how they've been persecuted on our Ether Hour episode. So be sure to check that out. And again, get behind the paywall. Even though that Ether Hour episode is completely free, we would not be able to do this stuff without our paywall supporters. So please consider supporting us. I think when I get back to the United States, I really need to set up a Ko-fi or a Buy Me a Coffee, because I am leaving money on the table from some of our loyal subscribers that would be willing to provide more and to tip us, as it were, for our work. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for those of you that do support. You really are the only reason that we can do the work that we do. But the Moldovan situation is very unfortunate. Dimitri, I know you had the details on the tiny number of Pridnestrovians that voted, which makes sense when the Moldovans were actively cheering the fact that, look, Pridnestrovia only supported the quote-unquote pro-Russian parties by like 1 or 2%. This shows that everybody actually supports Moldova joining the EU. But when you look at the numbers, that's not the case at all.
No, I think it's actually quite insane. And in fact, there were even Russian liberals, like people who are literally listed as inagenti, that is, foreign agents inside of Russia, criticizing this election. It was so blatantly stolen. In fact, most of these Russian libtards were essentially anti-Putin as well. And they were saying, look, Maya Sandu is just a female Putin. She also stole her election. And it's like everyone clearly could see this was a new Zelensky-esque power grab from, PAS, her Party of Action and Solidarity, right? And it's very clear, like the Transnistria example is the most explicit. So Transnistria has, let's just say, roughly 450,000 people, right? Somewhere in this range. 300,000 of them are adults and within the voting range. Only 12,000 of them, as far as we know, this week have voted in this election. 12,000 out of 300. Like, it's just, I'm sorry. Like, these are huge numbers of the potential electorate, which for whatever reason have been completely ostracized or left out. Maybe they weren't able to, again, as Conrad said, to travel between Pridnestrovia and Greater Moldova to visit one of these voting booths, or there was issues of mail-in ballots, for example. Who knows what exactly the problem was, but clearly there's a non-participation of a very high number of people. There's also, and this is, by the way, all this information is coming from essentially liberal sources. The liberals are essentially stating that the two Russian parties that were banned, and there were many others that were banned years prior, but the two that were actually enrolled to run in this election, Conrad, they were fairly, let's just say, pro-Russian and right-wing, and they were supposed to get at least tens of thousands of votes within Moldova itself because of the clear escalation during the SMO. Clearly, it's a polarizing thing. And as you can see, even PAS winning with 51% of the vote, it's clearly neck and neck, similar to the American election where it was like Kamala Harris and Trump, Trump only winning by a few percentage points here. And the two parties that were banned were actually not removed from the ballots. And all the votes that went towards them were not transferred to the other pro-Russian party. They just went into the void, into nothingness. So you had essentially villages which were, let's just say, they were pro-Russian, they were pro-Transnistrian, for example, who would vote against PAS, and they would vote for one of the parties, which obviously, if you haven't followed the news, and in Moldova, look, certain villages are just not as connected to the internet, for example, as much as in other places in Europe. It is a very poor country. And if they didn't hear that these two parties were completely removed, they would still tick that they would give their priority vote to one of these parties that were already banned, and their vote would count for nothing. And I mean, me and you, Conrad, we don't believe in liberal democratic voting systems in the first place, but this is just like doubling or tripling down on the entire fraudulent democratic scheme. And I mean, this is a slap in the face. And again, it shows you the hypocrisy, the double standards. Clearly, Europe has, not just the European officials have donated, there's clearly official lobbying, but we just call it what it is. It's open bribery happening from EU officials towards Maya Sandu and PAS. And although any sort of financial support coming out from the Russian Federation is considered almost like hostile terrorist-style funding or some sort of black market money, for example, it's just completely a two-faced approach to domestic politics in Moldova. Unfortunately, we have to just call it what it is. The election in Moldova in 2025 was stolen. As stolen as the American election in 2020, 2021. So that's exactly what happened this last week on the 28th of September and onwards on that weekend. And I think we can, as I said, Conrad, very conclusively off air, if you can count the voting booths in Russia, there's one in St. Petersburg, one in Moscow. And why the two major cities, the two capitals of Russia, you can almost say it's because most Moldovans, 650,000 of them or so, they mostly travel to Russia for economic reasons, for work, because obviously they earn a larger salary and then they travel back home, to support their families. It's very common for them to settle around these two major cities. And so a lot of them would visit one or two of these voting booths. Of course, you can imagine the huge lines, etc. Many of them probably not even getting an opportunity to vote on that particular weekend. But keep in mind, the voting booths all over Europe numbered in the hundreds, including a country like Italy, for example, which, look, I'm not sure how many people there are in Italy of Moldovan descent or even citizens of Moldova, but I bet it would number like less than 100,000 easily. So there were 30 booths all over Italy, including Sicily itself, like for voting for Moldovan citizens. And in every single European Union country, there was voting booths for Moldovans. And of course, most likely, if those who traveled to the European Union, most of them most likely were of some sort of liberal mindset. And still, pass only won with 1% of the vote, despite all of the stolen votes and, of course, probably obscure votes that went into the void, of course, voted for the right-wing parties. And it's just very clear to me that this the stolen election will clearly lead to very negative consequences, both between Moldova and Pridnestrovia, but also between the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and that entire Eastern European theater is only going to be negatively impacted, because inevitably I think we will see an escalation in Odessa on the northwestern Black Sea coast. I think we've spoken about this for a while. There's even been officials within the Russian SMO zone, people like Dmitry Rogozin, for example, who recently gave a very hot interview. Of course, he's now a senator from Zaporozhye, and in his interview, of course, he said many interesting things, including the need for all these cities to return to Russia, including Nikolaev, Odessa. But he said also a very interesting comment, and this is a bit of an aside, about like how Ukrainians are essentially brainwashed Russians, but there are these two other entities within Ukraine. He said one of them is somewhat internationalist and sort of a different ethnicity, he said. He started talking about genetics, and it was very interesting how the Russian Senator Dmitry Rogozin, a former head of Roscosmos, the Russian NASA, started talking about essentially not eugenics, but just the racial differences of Ukrainians. And he said there's this other racial group within Ukraine who they're not Slavic at all. They're not related to us by blood, he said. And they rule things. And he didn't get into too many details, but this triggered a lot of people. But overall, we have to say about Moldova as well, its political elite is entirely foreign. Not only are they pro-Romanian, being pro-Romanian inherently is not a bad thing. However, the elites in Romania, as we saw in their stolen election in December 2024, are clearly not pro-Romanian people anyway. This is a transnational elite. This is essentially a colony of NATO, a colony of the EU, and it's being run in a similar way to how Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka were run by the British Empire and all the other colonial authoritative states prior to that. It's exactly the same thing. So the elites of these nations have nothing to do in common with the native population. And this is very sad, Conrad, because it's much easier for them. They will not hesitate in order to suppress, attack the church. And if the church remains stalwart in its essentially ethical and moral views, which go against essentially these new European values, so to speak. And Putin commented on this during his Valdai speech. He said that Europe is changing. There's been a lot of anti-European rhetoric within Russia, but Putin even said directly, he said, look, a lot of conservative Europeans love Russia today. A lot of them travel to Russia, obtain a citizenship of the Russian Federation because they see their own European cities like Paris, Berlin, London itself. A lot of these cities are changing demographically, culturally. And Putin essentially said that Europe is undergoing some sort of negative shift. And he didn't necessarily say who's behind all of this. I think we all know he doesn't really necessarily even need to openly state this, but we clearly see the same is possibly proposed for countries like Romania in the future, if not for, of course, the strong native Christian, Orthodox Christian population. Moldova itself, of course, remains strongly Orthodox, including the Gagazian population. But at the moment, Conrad, we don't have a good prognosis for the country in and of itself. It remains under an occupied regime. And yes, they will continue to gaslight all the right-wing people and conservatives within the nation and sort of proclaim them pro-Russian when again, they're only pro-Moldovan at the end of the day. These are not Russians by ethnicity. These are simply people who wish the best for their own country and they wish to remain Christian, as opposed to whatever ideology the Marxists of the now enlightened West are trying to push upon them.
And these are people that actually understand Orthodox ecclesiology. They don't have some desire to be Russified. They just understand that a parish commemorating Patriarch Kirill is canonical and those that don't are not. And that's exactly the same situation that was going on in Ukraine for a while. And it's the same situation in many other places. So this idea that just because these people want to be under their canonical bishop without violating the canonical process doesn't mean somehow that they are post-Soviet Russophiles or something like that. It's just very slanderous what people are trying to convince people the Moldovan faithful actually believe and actually want. But of course, there were other elections recently, the Japanese elections, which I didn't follow quite as closely, but the new prime minister of Japan is Sanai Takaichi. She is a member of the LDP, which basically the whole prime minister war was a internal LDP faction war, and she is considered the quote-unquote far-right candidate as opposed to the more center-right candidate who just lost. This is from Bellum Acta. It says, the first female prime minister of Japan happens to be an anti-China hawk, perhaps the most anti-China figure in LDP since Shinzo Abe himself. She's a Nippon Kaigi member, which is the Japanese Shinto nationalist organization. She's a Shinzo Abe loyalist, a migration restrictionist, and a normalizer of minor far-right parties like Sansaito and the Conservative Party of Japan, which are openly ethno-nationalist and extremely anti-migration. Of course, this is good for the people of Japan. However, I am personally fearful that this will be used by the United States to escalate against China. We might even see a remilitarized Japan as a sort of Eastern NATO bloc forms with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines to counter, Chinese expansion in the South China Sea, as well as, the growing ascendancy of North Korea with their nuclear weapons and their much higher birth rate than their liberal southern neighbors. On the live stream, for example, after the election, the defeated center-right candidate Shinjiro Koizumi, he appeared to be almost crying after he was defeated. So I guess he might have actually thought that he had a chance to win. So we'll be keeping up with Japan closely. I'm grateful that hopefully they can reverse the pro-migration trends that were occurring in Japan, because the best thing about Japan is that it's full of Japanese people and not like Europe, which is full of a bunch of foreign faces that would rather scam you for cheap goods or rob you than contribute to your enjoyment of this beautiful cradle of civilization, which Dimitri and I, as Europeans, obviously want to be able to enjoy, and many other Europeans want to as well. But moving on from there, of course, China is building new aircraft carriers. They are going to probably in the next decade surpass the United States, even in the amount of new and modern aircraft carriers that they have. So it would make sense that Japan would become this new sort of island that they're trying to militarize against the massive force that is China. But of course, moving on, we're in the miscellaneous news section here, and the TikTok sale has effectively begun to go through, which is something we covered a few months back pretty heavily. And this is a good article from JobSite News. It says, everything is coming together for Larry Ellison, the billionaire co-founder of tech giant Oracle, on and off again the richest man in the world and a staunch supporter of Israel, is set to take a lead role in reshaping TikTok in the United States. His son, David Ellison, is moving to take over large swaths of the media, including CBS News, CNN, Warner Brothers, and Paramount, reportedly bringing in the Free Press's Barry Weiss to shape editorial direction. The Ellison family is cornering the market on attention and data the same way the Vanderbilts did railroads and the Rockefellers did oil, as Wired recently characterized it. How they plan to operate that monopoly is on course to be tested out in what President Donald Trump is calling New Gaza, the techno-dystopian free trade zone that is to be administered by a board of peace led by Trump and Ellison's longtime political and business vehicle, Tony Blair. Ellison has given or pledged more than $350 million to the Tony Blair Institute, which Blair has used to advance Ellison's vision of a marriage between government, corporate power, and tech surveillance. Oracle, by providing database infrastructure and cloud computing services to other huge enterprises like FedEx and NVIDIA, has quietly become one of the most powerful companies in the world. As the nation's top diplomat, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also played a role in the TikTok talks that steered company toward Ellison. After playing a lead role as a senator in demonizing the app, he was also closely involved in the rollout of Trump's plan for Gaza's future, which hands the enclave to Blair. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, tasked the Blair Institute in the spring with coming up with a post-war plan for Gaza, which was recently completed, the Times of Israel reported. That Rubio finds himself in such a central position is in part thanks to Ellison, who has been a major patron of the Cuban-American former senator from Florida. Ellison first vetted Rubio for his fealty towards Israel back in early 2015, according to previously unreported email correspondence reviewed by JobSite. Rubio rose to prominence as a Tea Party-backed conservative Senate upstart in 2010, launching a presidential campaign in the 2016 cycle. As Secretary of State, Rubio launched an unprecedented crackdown on speech, detaining and attempting to deport critics of Israel precisely for the crime of their criticism of the Jewish state. In early 2015, Ellison was emailing Ron Prosor, who was serving on the tail end of his time as Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. He currently serves as the Israeli ambassador to Germany. At the time, Rubio was seen as a strong challenger in a GOP presidential field that would ultimately include underdog candidate Donald Trump. The emails show the Israeli diplomat and Ellison arranging to meet with one another, with Prosor soliciting Ellison's views on Rubio as a potential candidate who would advocate on behalf of Israel. On April 26, 2015, Prosor sent Ellison an email titled Rubio's Speech, asking the Oracle founder and CTO to send him a copy of a speech from the then candidate. The emails don't specify which speech, but Rubio had kicked off his campaign a week earlier with a speech that criticized the Obama administration's hostility to Israel. The next day, the two traded messages indicating that Prosor and Ellison had dinner together and that Ellison would soon be meeting Rubio directly. I had a great time too, Ron. I'm looking forward to next time, Ellison said. P.S. I'll tell you how dinner goes with Senator Rubio. On April 30th, Prosor sent another message to Ellison to follow up, sharing his phone number and thanking him again for the evening they spent together. How was the conversation with Marco Rubio? Did he pass your scrutiny? Did you have a chance to talk about Israel? Would love to chat. A few hours later, Ellison responded in the affirmative. Hi, Ron. Great meeting with Marco Rubio. I set him up to meet with Tony Blair, adding Marco will be a great friend for Israel. So Marco Rubio has effectively been groomed all the way up to the point where they thought he could be president, but all the way up to the point where he's now Secretary of State in charge of American foreign policy and is now, as I said, handing over Gaza to the Tony Blair Institute, which I'm sure I don't know if there's internal fighting between Palantir, Peter Thiel, and Ellison and Oracle, or if they're more collaborative. But it's clear that Ellison is making a play to be the tech oligarch of the future. He is the second richest person in the world, right after Elon Musk, because Elon Musk did recently supposedly hit $500 billion worth of net worth. But with all these deals, who knows? Perhaps Ellison could surpass him, or perhaps Ellison would be the richest man in the world if he's not spending a lot of his capital right now to increase influence as opposed to actual, I guess, money to be calculated on the Forbes list. But this is quite the interesting revelation. And it's so funny that Tony Blair is still so relevant. They clearly outsourced him to the NGO space after he was, ousted from politics. So we're going to be keeping up with this very closely. Obviously, we've discussed the sort of Jewish tech oligarch panopticon that is emerging, and how Gaza will be sort of the testing ground for what they want to do to the rest of us Goyim here in the West. So we're going to be watching that very closely. If you have any thoughts on that, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your perspective before we move on to church news.
Of course, this is all very, very dark. And look, we don't necessarily support like a pro-China type censorship either. Like, we understand TikTok was heavily influenced by the government of the People's Republic of China. However, if you look at even just framing what was taking place, so TikTok offended not just the Trump administration, but the pro-Israeli crowd, the people behind the scenes, those who support Zog, for one particular reason. And that's because they, of course, posted uncensored and unfiltered opinions about the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza itself for the last 2 years. And this is why I think Ellison was called upon to make this purchase happen. And of course, maybe they tugged some strings within China itself in order to have this operation smooth out. Of course, we understand the People's Republic of China most likely led by primarily commercial considerations first and foremost, rather than those of some sort of international community and actually liberating the world from Zog. So we have to sort of keep a sober perspective in all of this. And just in relation to sober perspective, as we shift to church news, just another feather in the cap of all of us, those people who've been calling the entire creation of the OCU, the fake Ukrainian Orthodox Church, granted a Tomos by Patriarch Bartholomew years ago now. It seems like almost a decade ago, but look, it's almost become a recent church history. This is one of the most shamed, I think, moves by any patriarch. And look, the fruits of it are very obvious. So what took place? So this independent church set up by Patriarch Bartholomew and Mike Pompeo is now, of course, inviting LGBTQ Lutheran bishops. So the episcopate elite of the European community of Lutherans has visited Kiev, surprisingly enough. And of course, this all took place in an occupied cathedral, St. Michael's Cathedral, actually, Archangel Michael's Cathedral, which unfortunately Dymenko has complete authority over at this point. And this liturgy was, again, it wasn't a co-service, so to speak, so they didn't necessarily conduct full-on ecumenism, but the Lutheran bishops stood there in their vestments. Now, keep in mind, like, there was Lutheran bishops, for example, like the chair of Norwegian Bishops' Conference, Olav Tveit, and this is a man who is in support of the LGBTQ. As you may know, most of us have sort of by default assumed the Lutheran Protestant denomination is somewhat conservative, right, given the name and everything. But no, they've been actually pushing, especially low church Lutheranism, they've been pushing the LGBTQ alphabet community agenda very strongly. And the Archbishop of Finland was there as well, again, Lutheran Tapio Luoma, and he, of course, supports the marriage of homosexual couples as well. And these are all people who were witnessing the liturgy of Sergei Dymenko, Epiphany Dymenko, that is the false Metropolitan of Kiev. So this is all incredibly shameful. Of course, the Lutheran head of the Iceland, actual bishopess, Gudrun Karls Helgatir, or I believe, she actively participates in LGBTQ parades as a bishopess. So I think that kind of describes everything we need to know about this particular congregation. And these are the allies of the independent so-called autocephalous or autonomous Church of Ukraine, supported by Patriarch Bartholomew. Incredibly shameful, but we'll never hear it from any of the Greek Orthodox Christian bishops, unfortunately, sort of critiquing this particular meeting of the minds inside of the Archangel Michael Cathedral. And, speaking about occupied churches and monasteries in the Kiev Pechersky Lavra, the now desecrated Lavra, many years now occupied, there was an art gallery exhibition. And they had essentially this, and I'm struggling to call this an icon, essentially this abhorrent image of what appears to be their version of the Theotokos. And on her head, instead of a cross, atop her veil, she had the Ukrainian coat of arms. And she was pierced by arrows. She was holding a heart. And this was kind of done pretending to be, somewhat pious, but from pro-Ukrainian perspective. And then she was holding the heart, and the heart was sort of bleeding over the map of Ukraine. And there was Ukrainian heraldry all over the icon. Not a single image of the cross actually on the icon was present. So just the desecrated icon of the Theotokos in an occupied Orthodox Christian monastery. What else could be more sacrilegious, of course, and blasphemous? Of course, quite degenerate. And again, this won't be brought up by your people calling for sort of ecumenist solidarity and all of this. And again, this is the two-faced approach they have to all of this. These sort of concerns calling us very conservative Orthodox Christians as right-wing and reactionary, and we're not understanding, even though we call these things out. And speaking of somebody who's a bit more moderate, Conrad, the voice of reason in the Orthodox Ukrainian scene, of course, the man who's really taken a very mid-range position on most issues, Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich, who's the right-hand man of Metropolitan Onufri, essentially his head secretary. And of course, Metropolitan Onufri is suffering probably from a lot of pressure, of course, being put on him by the Ukrainian government. Metropolitan Anthony does lead a lot of the synod meetings being called in the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Recently, he gave a very good sermon on the question of autocephaly, because there's been in an entire movement. I think that the famous Kiev seminary, the head of that seminary, I think it's a Ukrainian bishop, and he's actually pro autocephaly. So he's trying to push Metropolitan Onufri and his bishops to this position of, well, we need to seek complete independence as opposed to autonomy from the Russian church. We need to cut ourselves off. Even though, as you mentioned, Conrad, earlier, in relation to Elder Zosima and Saint Zosima of Donbass, what was his primary message? It was, do not seek autocephaly. That is spiritual death. It is, he commented on that multiple times. And again, if we cover him in a future AFAO episode, we'll talk about most of his clairvoyant sayings and prophecies about this entire conflict and even the spiritual downfall. But Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich mirrors Elder Zosima's concerns, and he says that, look, autocephaly, in fact, historically, doesn't, of course, there's no evidence that it supports an increase of sanctity, an increase in saints in a church that becomes autocephalous. And if it's done on the wrong grounds, for example, on grounds of patriotism or some sort of national strength or nationalism, and on grounds of independence on a national level, really doesn't lead to an improvement in the spiritual life of the people who actually obtain that autocephaly. So autocephaly needs to come from a very spiritual and pious place, first and foremost. You cannot willfully, passionately call for it. It's not a political movement. It's not a movement of rebellion. In fact, it's not political at all in its sort of sphere and in its definition. And just a very important piece of news, and we have to keep this holy bishop of the Ukrainian people in our prayers, and we have for a long time, because since April 2024, of course, he's been imprisoned. This is the head of the Svyatogorsk monastery, which is the monastery on the background of our eighth-hour episodes, that beautiful Whitestone monastery, which the Russians are only 10 kilometers away from liberating. He's been in Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro prison for the last just over a year now. And unfortunately, he's had a court hearing on the 1st of October. And the judge was, of course, a female now named Tatiana Haustova. And during the court hearing, he had what appears to be some sort of health complication related to his heart. And the judge actually did not want to stand the hearing down nor adjourn it for a long time, until literally they had to call an ambulance into the hearing room and take a Metropolitan Arseny of Svyatogorsk Monastery away. So there's real concerns that he's suffering from, obviously the psychological and the health pressure, and who knows what else. They're feeding him in these particular prison cells, similar to Metropolitan Jonathan earlier, who suffered a stroke whilst in Ukrainian custody, being psychologically tortured, and Metropolitan Longin, of course, Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy. All of these people have faced health complications whilst, of course, being harassed and attacked by the Ukrainian terror state, which is essentially anti-Christian. So we hope the same does not happen in Moldova. But Metropolitan Arseny, yes, someone who always appeared to be in good health, more or less, and he's not relatively an old man, but even he, just over the last year, being incarcerated for so long and separated from his flock, from the monastery itself, and from probably a proper spiritual life in like almost Bolshevik-like conditions, is now, of course, suffering. So we need to keep him in our prayers. And if he does, in fact, pass away, in Ukrainian custody, I think he basically will become one of the first new martyrs of the new sort of special military operation type Ukrainian conflict. We can actively say that. So over the last decade, there's been many good Orthodox Christians slain in this particular disastrous turn of events that has happened in Eastern Europe, but he could openly be called a new martyr due to the persecution currently taking place. So we have to keep him in our prayers, and hopefully the Lord, keeps him with us for a long time. Because remember, his charges are not related to, they're completely made up. So his charges are that he, during a sermon, because he complained during a sermon that the roads towards the monastery were blocked by Ukrainian inspection posts. And he mentioned that in the sermon. He said, well, thank you. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something akin to, thank you all of, brothers and sisters for coming to this liturgy. Unfortunately, the roads to the monastery were blocked over by Ukrainian troops. And the Ukrainians used that sermon as evidence against them. And they claimed that, and they charged them with essentially assisting the Russian military in spotting and identifying Ukrainian block posts and essentially patrols because of what he mentioned in this. I mean, it's completely insane. No country obviously should sort of condone this sort of behavior, but that's what's happening at the moment in Ukraine. And Conrad, look, you've seen churches you mentioned earlier, bombed monasteries, things which really shouldn't happen. And yes, we understand an accident here and there, but I mean, the level of destruction is almost overshadowing anything we've seen, even in certain Middle Eastern places that ISIS and other organizations have gone through. So it's somewhat surprising that there's still people out there claiming that somehow Ukraine is this also a Christian country, whereas we see completely diametrically opposed opinions from the Russian side, clearly providing spiritual aid even to POWs of Ukrainian descent, whilst Russian POWs in Ukrainian, say, wartime prisons, Orthodox priests are not allowed to approach them. They receive spiritual and, shall we say, psychological support from Lutheran pastors and members of various Protestant denominations. And maybe at best they would get maybe like a Catholic priest or a uniate. But no, so we see huge, vast differences of approaches towards Orthodoxy. And that's despite the fact we can say this, maybe what if the Orthodox Church was only 5% of the population in Ukraine? Then we can say, well, maybe this can be justified. But no, 75% plus of the Ukrainian population is in some way, even nominally speaking, Orthodox Christian. And so this is completely insane. This is why the government in Ukraine really needs to go, I think, despite any sort of ceasefire, peace treaty. I mean, it's really worse than anybody can really imagine. It's hard to describe the level of sacrilege taking place there, Conrad. And the fact that you've seen it yourself, really, in the Donbass Oblast is testament to that.
No, it's true. I'm going to be releasing some videos that show a church that was the dividing line between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, and you can see the massive strikes that the Ukrainians did not care at all about protecting the church, whereas the Russian side was, sure, there's still some shrapnel and some bullet holes, but no artillery strikes. Clearly, they were intentionally avoiding the beautiful temple. But other persecution news, of course, the headline here from Ortho Christian, Hierarch responds to threats against Orthodox Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. His Eminence Metropolitan Fotier of Zrvonico and Tuzla of the Serbian Orthodox Church has issued a statement expressing deep concern over recent threats directed at Orthodox Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Metropolitan reports that an individual who desecrated the Church of the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos in Tuzla several months ago again has issued threats by removing a cross and calling for the Islamization of Serbian clergy and people, which has further disturbed our small community. These incidents are part of a continuing pattern of attacks on the Orthodox community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Metropolitan Fotier notes that attacks on clergy homes in the city have increased recently, with windows recently being broken at a house where one of their priests lives. These attacks are not merely acts of vandalism, but represent a serious threat to the safety of clergy and their families, as well as a broader endangerment of peace and security in our community. An increased risk of radicalization is spreading in our society. Attacks on religious schools as well as on clergy homes are not just attacks on individuals, but on fundamental human and religious rights. So they're calling on, the international community, which already runs Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's a fake country, to protect them. Obviously, we know that we've seen the clips from Kosovar Albanians during the Kosovo Wars and everything, desecrating and destroying and removing the crosses from Serbian churches. So this is obviously a very serious fear. So we have to pray, of course, for the church in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then the final story here, making fun of the Anglicans who, again, if you're Anglican and still really believe in God or care about Jesus Christ at all, it's time to just become Orthodox. The Church of England has named its first female Archbishop of Canterbury. Sarah Mullally is the next leader of the Anglican Communion. She's 63 years old, is now the spiritual head of 85 million Anglicans globally. Like her predecessors, will face a communion divided by over several issues. This is from Al Jazeera. Mullally replaces Justin Welby, who resigned due to a child abuse cover-up scandal last year. The new Archbishop addressed congregants for the first time at Canterbury Cathedral on Friday. And of course, one of the immediate things she talks about, one of the first things she says, I know that God who is with us draws near to those who suffer. We then, as a church, have a responsibility to people who stand with the Jewish community against anti-Semitism in all its forms. Hatred and racism of any kind cannot be allowed to tear us apart. So obviously the African Anglicans came out and criticized her for being a female bishop at all. And now, as the head of the entire church, there was a brief period when King Charles ascended to the throne where both the titular head of the Church of England, who is the monarch of the UK, was King Charles and was a male. But now that's quickly been reversed and they're back with female leadership once again. And again, at this point, if you are, obviously a lot of the people are now continuing Anglicans or Anglicans that have schismed from the Church of Canterbury itself. But at a certain level, you need to realize that all of that is sort of a silly cope. And I encourage any Anglican listeners, it is time to fully embrace Orthodoxy. In England in particular, we've seen a lot of parishes actually join Orthodoxy en masse from Protestantism. So it's very real. It's very possible. The churches there are very beautiful. They wouldn't necessarily need just to add some iconostases, and then you're pretty much good to go in a lot of these Anglican parishes. In fact, on this trip here, people really need to check it out. My appearance on the Delling Pod with James Dellingpole, very, very popular podcast. You should be able to find it for free in a week or two when he releases everything behind this paywall, and then a few weeks later puts it all out for free. We discuss the Romanov royal martyrdom. We discuss Orthodoxy. James was in Russia venerating the saints with me and making sure that he was praying for his wife who was sick, and he himself, very much loves Orthodoxy and would in many ways, I think, like to convert. But of course, living in England, he's sort of stuck under the Anglican yoke, and he's trying to be with his family. So pray for James. Listen to our podcast together. It's really, really a good episode. We filmed it in a hotel room I was staying at in Moscow, which was very cool. So we discuss all this sorts of stuff, and I'm going to talk to James soon here about his thoughts on the new Archbishop and maybe if he's become even more open to becoming Orthodox. So pray for the Anglican faithful. Pray that the good, faithful people among them that still exist are finally able to cleave themselves to Orthodoxy and not be a part of this heretical communion, which unfortunately has been heretical, non-canonical, and full of ecclesiastical nonsense since it was formed by King Henry VIII. But unless you have anything else to say about church news, Dimitri, what are your thoughts on this development? And we can start to land this plane.
No, I think this is just the ever-descending slippery slope of degeneracy and apostasy, right? We see at the same time Pope Francis, of course, blessing a block of ice. And this is like, a blessing of Greta Thunberg, or I'm not sure what exactly of, but, he's clearly not blessing the ice wall. It's just the promotion of a false ideology. In fact, we'd probably be more grateful if he commented more on the Gaza situation, or if he called for the Uniate Church of Ukraine, which fully supports, unfortunately, the bishopry of Ukraine, which is Roman Catholic, in the West. It fully supports the Zelensky regime. If he did more positive things towards actually bringing the world to a peaceful state. Nobody at the moment is talking about global warming. That particular psyop has completely been sort of removed from the public sphere. But it's just very shameful. And all these things, including, of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I even saw cope of the most abhorrent levels, Conrad, online. I saw sort of so-called based right-wing Anglicans, if you can even call them such a thing. They were saying that, well, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, he was somewhat supporting mass migration, and he was supporting, protecting the innocent Pakistanis caught in the whole rape gang situation, crisis, of course, which happened in England and was recently exposed and further promoted online by Elon Musk, sort of exposing that particular crisis. The Archbishop called for an end to racism in England, and apparently this new Archbishop will somehow, it's a bishopess or something, it will be more conservative. This is just levels of absurdity. It's a clown theater, several circles of hell, sort of removed from the bottom. And I think we just need to, if any Christians are still belonging to that particular denomination, I think it's time to search for orthodoxy primarily, like look into church history, read the scriptures, and just look at essentially when your particular church disconnected from the overall body of not just the Roman Catholics, but what essentially took place prior to even 1054 in the church. Like really do your research, because the state of your immortal soul matters a lot more than some sort of adherence to an apparently national church, which isn't even patriotic at this point, because the king and the archbishopess, they're completely betraying your interests, I'm sure, politically as well as spiritually. So there's no reason to remain Anglican in 2025, and not that there was even 100 or 200 years ago. But just very, somewhat surprising that things are moving so quickly, Conrad, in terms of apostasy. But we just have to sort of be prepared and call it out whenever it shows its ugly face.
No, that's a good way to put it. Obviously, pray for the long-suffering Christians all over the world. As we've done this show, the specter of persecution has only increased. It started in Ukraine, but now we talk about Syria, now we talk about Moldova, now we talk about Bosnia, now we talk about Estonia. So things have not necessarily gone in the right direction on that front. But just to read some final news about the Palestinian update, which I'm sure will have radically escalated even by the time you've listened to this. Hamas have confirmed to Al Arabiya that the delegation will arrive in Cairo by tonight to hold talks with Israel and the U.S. tomorrow. Egyptian, Qatari, and Turkish mediators are also scheduled to participate in the negotiations. Egypt will convene a meeting with all Palestinian factions to discuss post-war leadership. The topic remains one of the disagreements between Israel, U.S., and Hamas. Israel and the U.S. support an international stabilization force, while Hamas demand an internal Palestinian rule. And of course, this is big news. Taiwan in 2025 became the largest importer of Russian oil. They purchased oil worth $1.3 billion, increasing the average monthly import volume sixfold compared to 2022. Taiwan has spent $11.2 billion on Russian fuel since 2022, which is 220 times more than its aid to Ukraine. So that's an aspect of the China-Taiwan conflict that perhaps nobody has discussed, that Taiwan may not be completely willing to go the full U.S. route because they're clearly dependent on Russian oil. So with all of that, thank you all so much for tuning in. Please subscribe. Whether you're not a free subscriber yet, put your email into worldwarnow.co to get every episode. If you haven't already become a paid supporter, please consider it. You get access to hundreds and hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content, interviews with Father Peter Heers, Father John Whiteford, Steve Su, China experts, all sorts of experts from all over the world. My friend Andrei Afanasiev, who's been to Donbass 30 plus times, war correspondent. We've got a lot of big interviews planned in the future as well. More episodes with Gregory Heers. You can hear our full episodes about St. John the Tatsis behind the paywall, for example, as well as a whole host of content about the World War III prophecies. I will be releasing my interview with Gabriel Droshin soon. I will be releasing my interview with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Donetsk soon. I will be releasing my interview with the St. Alexander Nevsky Brigade soon. I will be releasing my interview with Metropolitan Mitrofan of Gorlovka soon. So this is must-listen to content. There is legitimately no other Orthodox journalism content of this caliber on the internet. So please consider getting behind the paywall and supporting us there. Be sure to follow us on X at @WorldWarNow_. Subscribe to our Telegram channel, World War Now Telly. Find us on Apple Podcasts. Find us on Spotify. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. When I'm back in the United States, I will begin to be doing my Tuesday evening live streams once again. So I apologize to all the World War Live supporters. I will be back soon. I can also say on this show that I likely am actually headed back to the Donbass at the end of October. So again, if you want to support the journalistic coverage that I'm doing there, please consider getting behind the paywall. Like this episode if you're listening on Substack and you haven't liked the episode. As far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me. So hit that like button, share with your subscribers, with your friends. If you're on YouTube, like the video there as well. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. It would really help me to do that. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. And with all of that, I will leave you with the last word, Dimitri.
Yes, of course. Most importantly, dear listeners, keep Conrad in your prayers. And we, of course, thank God for all the opportunities he's provided us on the show. Of course, for all of you, our dear listeners, we appreciate your support. And for Conrad's safe travels. And we pray that, of course, these conflicts in these Christian parts of the world end very shortly. So thank you, everyone, for your help. God bless.
See you on the next one, guys.